Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
Staring out the apartment window, I saw them. This sent a tingle down my spine as I watched them go about their malicious activities. I turned to my companion and glared. So, you think you have all the answers? Never said I did. On the contrary, you've told me more than once you know everything. If you're going to lie to me, just stay quiet. Whatever, but I've never lied to you. I folded my arms and stared hard at the individual in front of me. Fine. We have more important matters to discuss. I'm listening. Food. We're running out, and I have no clue where to get more. Have it delivered. I felt myself stiffen. Narrowing my eyes, I asked, by whom? By whoever does that sort of thing. How can you be so stupid? You know, if you don't want food delivered, you might actually need to leave the building. You don't get it, do you? Get what? I closed my eyes, shook my head, and took a deep breath. How dangerous it is out there. I pointed out the window. Sunshine keeps the others away, but it's been cloudy for months, making it unsafe to walk around. What others? You know, them. Oh, good grief. What are you talking about? Who is them? I felt my hands clench so hard, my fingernails bit into my palms. You haven't heard a word I've said these past months, have you? My companion folded his arms. If you had listened to me, you would know we're the only sane ones left in the city. Everyone else has escaped. We're alone and being hunted. Yes, you've mentioned this several times. But if everyone is gone, who do you think is hunting us? I walked to the window and stared out. Our apartment, being on the 10th floor, provided a good view of what the world looked like. On the street below, a movement caught my eye. Pointing down, I returned my attention to him. There's one of them now. Hurry, you can see what I'm talking about. He shook his head. That's the wind blowing a tattered flag. You haven't looked. I don't need to. Trust me, it's your imagination. I looked back at the spot where I saw movement. Nothing. The image was gone. This time all I saw was torn fabric limp on a pole. A tear flowed down my cheek. I saw them. I swear I saw them. You want to see them, and therefore your mind lets you see them. I spun around and glared hard at my companion. I'm not crazy. In a gentle voice, my infuriating companion asked, Are you sure? Like I told you before, we're the only sane ones left. So I'm absolutely not crazy. I know you would like to believe that. But first, let me ask you a question. What? When was the last time you went outside? I don't know, a couple of days ago, maybe a week? It's been over a month. You're losing track of time, which I hate to say is the first hint you are losing your grip on reality. I am not losing my grip. I chose not to leave. Besides, they scare me. My buddy chuckled. Now we're getting to the heart of the problem. You're scared of your own imagination. It's not my imagination. They are out there, and they are hunting me. Closing his eyes, he took a deep breath. Then in a voice reminiscent of my mother, he asked, Why are they hunting you? I don't know, maybe to kill me. Or worse, steal my soul. Your own thoughts will not kill you, my friend. Why do you always try to be so logical? I know if I go outside, They will kill me. If you're so smart, tell me why I feel that way. Because it's what you believe. However incorrect you might be, it's what you accept as reality. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. With sudden clarity, I realized the problem. It's you. You're one of them. You're the one driving me nuts. I am not making you crazy. But you are. How? By constantly telling me how I've lost my grip on reality and badgering me about seeing shadows where there are none. I pointed out the window again. You're just like the rest of them. Why are you treating me this way? Better it to be me than anyone else. I'm sure my scream of indignation could be heard by all the souls around us. Clenching my fists, I felt my face flush. I grabbed an empty glass on the table next to me and threw it at him. The mirror shattered, and he was gone. My breathing grew rapid and my heart thumped within my chest. Turning to the window, I looked out. They were all on the street staring up at me. The tightness in my chest intensified as they pointed in my direction. They had found me. Throwing the window open, I started screaming. I could hear laughter. They all pointed up at me and their taunts intensified. I turned back to the mirror. I could now see a distorted image of my companion. He also pointed and laughed at me. Look at yourself. You have finally lost what little grasp of sanity you possessed. Now take a deep breath and calm down. No, I hissed. You have no idea what I am going through. My dear friend, I know you better than yourself. Now, calm down and close the window. It's freezing out there. You don't know me. Who do you think I am? I sobbed and shook my head. I don't know anymore. I'm you, you idiot. Now shut the damn window and calm down. Staring at him with disbelief, I screamed, No! I realized escape was my only option. I had to escape the madness. Glancing back at the open window, the decision came easy. I made a mad dash toward it and leapt.
One. Fritz swept dust into a plastic dustpan and threw it into a waiting trash can. But even old and at a distance, Peepaw saw the line of dirt left over. Fritz was agitated, and it made the boy sweep absolutely for shit. Not that the shop had to look all that neat. People didn't come for the cement floors or the whitewashed walls, but for his famed pickles. They drove hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles, and handed over wads of cash for jars of the stuff.
Fritz! Go ahead and sweep that again,
he said from his leaning spot in the corner. Peepaw himself resembled the pickles he sold. He was a short man of few dimensions and had a distinct bump on the side of his nose.
And thinking on it, after, go straighten out those jars over there. Line up those labels uniform-like I tell you.
Fritz threw his head back, his shoulders dropping as though the broom and dustpan suddenly weighed a tremendous amount. He gave a pained look to the clock on the wall.
Not the clock,
the elder said, pointing.
The spot where you just were.
Peepaw,
Fritz complained.
It's 2 minutes to 5. Let's just lock up.
I wasn't aware I was keeping you from something,
Peepaw said.
Got somewhere to be?
Well...
Hey, remember, I'm the one doing your mom the favor,
he told Fritz.
She doesn't want you snorting this or smoking that. It's not like I need someone to sweep the floors like crap. I did that fine before.
It's just, I told Alexandra I'd meet her after work.
Fritz confessed.
She's gonna wait for me on the bench outside the candy shop. I promised I'd bring a jar of spicy garlic.
Stay away from that girl,
The elder snapped.
Careful. It's the pickles she wants, and not the one you're trying to give.
Fritz's face dropped.
Not everyone's after our pickles.
My pickles. And yes, they are.
No, Peepaw, they're...
A 200-year-old recipe. And you don't think everyone's after these pickles. It's all they talk to me about.
Fritz groaned.
That's because you never leave the store.
The elder grinned.
You got me there. We close when we close. So get sweeping.
2. Councilman Taylor had no idea how many cigarettes or bottle of cola he had had. He had hardly moved from his bench for hours. He watched the pickle shop with a quiet disdain. "We sell pickles" was written on the lone sign in the window, and to Taylor's annoyance, the county record showed the shop was registered as simply Pickles. During his stakeout, he counted over 100 people going in with money and coming out with armfuls of pickle jars. Thinking of all that money really bothered the councilman. Taylor, as head of Dodge Chamber of Commerce, looked at their little downtown as a point of pride. Dodge itself was an agriculture town dominated by a big slaughterhouse, so the old-time architecture and painted block of storefronts on Main was a bit of refinement. Except for the eyesore, "We sell pickles." Unlike the other shops, "We sell pickles" bore no decorations, even during Christmas or Easter, when all of downtown gussied themselves up with bunting and ribbons and window paint. Even worse, the store sat near one of the first corners of downtown, so that the diminutive and creatively compliant Cheryl's Honey House was dwarfed by the big windows and uniform rows of pickles, onions, okra, jalapenos, and anything that could be pickled, all beneath a paper sign declaring "We sell pickles" in thick black letters. Sure, "We sell pickles" may have only turned away a handful of people a week, but Dodd could use every penny after the bad press because of those silly murders. On the sly, offers were made to replace "We sell pickles." Everything from cafes, antique shops, a locally sourced wine room, and 2 leather companies offered to have Peepaw Pickles' legs broken to move a deal along. Yet dislodging "We sell pickles," Taylor found, was nearly impossible. Not only did the old pickle man pay his rent on time in full, he did so months in advance. Of all the shop owners, he alone never complained about the county appraisal that raised their rent. And even worse, people loved those pickles. Everyone Taylor saw go into the shop came out carrying jars and smiling. They came from all over, too. Taylor took special notice of the out-of-state plates, and the further the state, the more they'd park on the street, walk right past the other shops and their nice displays to go right into "We sell pickles." These out-of-towners usually left with a lot of sloshing pickle jars and expressions that reminded Taylor of an uncle of his who used to huff antifreeze. Some pickle eaters even drove off with a pickle sticking out from between their teeth like cigars. Smoking, Taylor went over his plan. Past closing, he'd break into "We sell pickles." Surely there'd be something he could find, a violation or evidence of a crime, to finally be rid of the pickle store. Often he had seen Peepaw Pickle spit his chew on the street, and Taylor was certain he probably did so around the pickles. It was good for Taylor that Peepaw Pickles was as rigid with his schedule as he was with his lack of community participation. 3. Councilman Taylor wasn't sure how so much grass could grow between buildings when the alleys hardly got any light, but as the sun set, he found himself in thigh-high grass behind a strip of downtown stores. He was sure there was nothing in the grass but some mosquitoes and ticks that fed on rats. Taylor waited until the last few minutes of light before prying open the We Sell Pickles service door with a small crowbar. The door made a loud, painful sound. Taylor waited a few moments to see if anyone heard before slipping into the building. He entered the service space meant for electricians and plumbers to do their routine checks away from any customers or tourists. Those spaces doubled as emergency exits for shopkeepers who might be in the back of their shops during a fire or some other emergency. Taylor knew enough to disconnect the fire door so he wouldn't set off the alarm. If it went off, the county fire department would swarm en masse because the fire department often had very little to do around Dodge. The back room was long, wide, with barrels of cucumbers and okra and peppers lined up against the walls. A big work table in the middle was stained from the splashes of pickle juice and vegetable debris. The vinegar smell made Taylor dizzy. After he got his camera ready, he ran his finger across the surface of the table. A dirty finger and a clean line across the grime would be great, Taylor thought. Yet there was nothing there. Not so much as a smudge of residue. The table, he was shocked to find, wasn't even sticky. The jars, Taylor prayed, had to be dirty, but like the table, they gleamed pristine in the camera flash. Not a single one even photographed cloudy. Next were the barrels, but for those, Taylor planned to snot into them and scratch his head until the surface got a light dusting of gray and hair. Yet he hadn't anticipated the smell. He had almost gotten used to the vinegar smell seeping from the hundreds of pickle jars, but opening a barrel, Taylor made the mistake of inhaling deeply. The garlic and vinegar and capers singed the inside of his nose, clinging to the sensitive flesh. He coughed until his eyes watered, crashing through the place. The only thing to bring him out of it was a doorknob jamming him painfully in the hip. He hissed, ingested more sharp pickled air, and used his tie to cover his nose and mouth. Catching his breath, Taylor saw a door nearly hidden in the dim depths of the room. It bore a paper sign that read, "No entry, especially you, Fritz." Taylor's imagination ran with all the possibilities of what lay behind the door. A hidden trash pile, a stash of at-home bug spray stored in a non-government approved way, maybe a whole stack of crates filled with rotten cucumbers that Peepaw Pickles sold to save money. Whatever was behind the door, there were possibilities, while in the current room there was just pristine frustration. The door was locked, but the door frame was so warped that the latch was exposed. Taylor used his councilman's ID to open it. There was no trash, no fetid crates. Instead, there was a narrow staircase going down into darkness. Taylor was stunned. There were no basements on that block, least of all any that looked to stretch below the neighboring stores. Phone lighting the way, Taylor descended the steps. The old planks dipped beneath his weight. The stairs ended almost 15 feet below the street level and emptied into a hall of brick, its floor plain cement. To his right, the hall dead-ended at a set of heavy wooden shelves laden with cloudy pickle jars. To his left, the hall stretched another 15 feet or so, ending with a wooden door. Iron bands kept the planks together. The door looked almost as old as the town. Light glinted between the slats of the door. The door was unlocked. 4. The door revealed a gigantic glass vat of pickle juice braced with iron reinforcements of an ancient make. Vegetable scraps and spices swirled slow in the sickly yellow-green solution. The walls surrounding the vat were covered in framed pictures and articles about We Sell Pickles. Among them as well was an outdated pinup calendar. Taylor looked at the vat and imagined Peepaw Pickle filling it with pre-measured ingredients so it might taste good enough to blight downtown Dodge for another decade. Taylor smiled, thinking if the pickle man went to such effort to conceal the vat, it must be his most precious secret. Yes, there were plenty of vendors who'd love to know Peepaw Pickle's recipes. Taylor imagined that with some well-groomed competition, We Sell Pickles might be outclassed into closing. Taylor looked around for something to collect the pickle juice, but there was nothing but a filthy bucket, and if anyone was to mimic the pickle brine, the sample had to be clean. Out in the hall, he found a dusty jar. The pop of its unsealing was like a gunshot. Shaking his furrowed nose at the closed stink in the jar, Taylor blew into it, sending a nimbus of dust into his own face. Back at the vat, he looked for some kind of spigot or valve on it, but couldn't find one. Exhausting all options on the ground, Taylor looked up at the vat's heavy lid. Sighing, he reminded himself that a little trouble now would grant Dodd a future without We Sell Pickles, and when Taylor, an old man, would look at Dodd's beautiful quaint downtown on some distant holiday, there'd be solid blocks of festive decorations and shopkeepers that understood the value of a cohesive community. Dreaming of some distant Christmas, Taylor went and found a stepladder to get him up to the lid. Once there, Taylor found the lid and its wheel latch were in good working order, oiled and dusted. Taylor couldn't think of a place to put the jar, so he stuck it between his thighs and tried opening the lid. The wheel groaned with each turn, and finally, the lid shook from release. The lid was heavy, and when Taylor pushed it open, the stepladder clattered on its legs. The lid swung up on its hinges, landed with a resounding crash that nearly knocked Taylor off the stepladder. Balance regained, he checked the glass sides for cracks. Seeing no leaks, Taylor steadied himself. One jar and they're gone, he thought, dipping the jar Achilles-like into the pickle juice. It filled a little, but seeing shreds of vegetable matter, Taylor leaned further, scooping them into the jar. It was best to get as many ingredients as possible. Taylor swirled the juice around in hopes of corralling more of the brown stuff. There was what looked like the bulb of a small dark-rooted onion, and Taylor went after it like it was a prize. He had to get on his tiptoes, but he got it. "Success," he whispered, bringing the jar up so he could look at his find. It swirled and tumbled and somersaulted to reveal itself with such a startling clarity that Taylor forgot to breathe. Turning gracefully in the jar was a human eye. Slightly shriveled, the whites dyed the sickly green-yellow of pickle brine, and the roots deflated into black threads. Taylor dropped the jar into the vat, not thinking of retrieving it. He had to get to the sheriff. He had thought to catch We Sell Pickles violating health codes, not hiding body parts. But as he descended the rickety stepladder, something like a shadow within the depths of the vat caught his eye. The shape rising and breaking the brine surface caused a vinegar eruption. It lay across the lip on its side like a newly beached whale. The pickled thing had once been a man, an old one. His body had shrunk and wrinkled like a drowned thumb. The hands were curled up near its bearded chin. Within one eye was a thick garlic clove, brined the same yellow as the pickled thing's horrid teeth. Taylor took a moment to get the courage to examine the body, yet when he reached to touch it, the slick skin repulsed him, and he took a step down instead. He needed to be away and far from We Sell Pickles, he thought. But the pickled thing wanted different. It snatched at Taylor's arm and tried to pull itself out. It exhaled in bursts, each word a sharp spell that splattered herbs and vegetable bits across Taylor's face. It cleared its throat by gurgles and coughs and slapped around until he felt Taylor. The pickled thing clutched Taylor's arms with an unreal strength. Its old mouth, gray-gummed and toothless, enveloped Taylor's hand. The leathery tongue wiggled all through Taylor's fingers. The pickled thing retched.
Terrible! Terrible! They're goddamn terrible!
It spat.
Those are the worst damn pickles I ever tasted! You dumb little shit! My pecker spitting out a no good, no nothing like you is God's cruel joke, I tell you!
Taylor shrieked and lost his footing. His hand, greased with spit, slid from the pickled thing's grasp. In his fall, Taylor caught the lip of the vat, but that only gave the pickled thing a chance to slap around and catch the councilman again.
They ain't got no spice,
it said, his wooden fingers digging into Taylor's forearm.
They ain't got no snap. They're all soft and pudgy like a fat lady's fingers.
The pickled thing couldn't hold Taylor, and he fell flat with a loud thump. One of the pickled thing's hands and most of its other arm were locked onto Taylor's sleeve and wouldn't let go. The bones popped from their sockets, and the soggy flesh tore like cheesecloth. Yet the pickled thing still clung onto the lip of the container, the juice churning from his wild kicking.
There ain't much left in this jar but me and the recipe, you lout. And I ain't ever writing it down. Not now. Not never.
It rambled, yammering vaguely about recipes and whore sons and his deal-spiced legacy.
They promised me sons for my pickles and gave me nothing but bums. Bums! I swear by this brine.
Taylor didn't stay to hear the rest. He limped, fast as his portly body allowed, through the cellar hall and to the foot of the steps, all the time looking behind him and fearing that the pickled thing had gotten out of his container and crawled on its belly after him. But the pickled thing was content howling in its vat. Sighing, Taylor took the first step up the stairs, but stopped. Peepaw Pickle and his grandson stood at the top of the stairs.
Well, Fritz,
the old man said,
looks like we've got ourselves a real dilly of a pickle, don't we?
Sure do, Peepaw. We sure do.
5.
And that's why you're going down there and cleaning his tank,
Peepaw said, loading a heavy box into the back of his truck. Glum-faced, Fritz crossed the sidewalk into the store and got another box from a tall stack. When he returned, he handed Peepaw the box, saying,
He doesn't like me, and he's weird.
Watch it, boy,
Peepaw snapped.
That's my great-great-grand-Peepaw, and no shit he's weird. He's 200 years old, and being blind and pickled ain't doing his brains any favors. So you'll go down there and treat him with respect. He's fed us for generations.
I don't know why I have to...
Because it's your fault,
Peepaw said.
You're always out back smoking your stuff. And don't think I don't smell it on account of the pickles neither, because I do.
Fritz groaned, beginning an excuse, and a box slipped from his grasp. It hit the sidewalk, and the glass inside clinked together. Both heard a muffled crunch. Peepaw sighed.
And you wonder why you annoy the man, He spends his day in a jar and gets to come out to a careless no-good.
Fritz crouched and prodded the box with his fist.
I think it's okay.
Peepaw was struck dumb.
You think? You what? Go ahead and pick it up then, Go on.
Fritz lifted the box, its contents crunched and clinked, and took it over to Peepaw. The old man cut the tape seal with a pocket knife. He opened it, showing the contents to Fritz, and said,
They look okay.
The late evening painted everything in shadow, but the contents were undeniable. A jar filled with garlic and dill and peppers broken. Pickles strewn all over, though not in enough abundance to hide the pieces of Taylor. A plump hand, an ear, an eye and tongue.
I swear,
Peepaw said.
Drop another, and I'll put you in the vat to keep him company. You!
Y'all ain't usually open this late,
a voice called.
Trouble with the help?
Peepaw and Fritz turned. Sheriff Lieben shut his cruiser door and walked up to them. Raising his hand to acknowledge the lawman, Peepaw chuckled and said,
I think I'm madder at myself for expecting more out of a lousy teenager.
Don't be too hard on him, the sheriff said, shaking Peepaw's hand. Then he saw the leaking box in Fritz's arms.
Oh, wasting good pickles, huh?
The sheriff shook his head. That's a hanging offense in Dodge, son. The sheriff smiled. But for a box of pickles, he pointed to a stack near the door. I'm sure I can look the other way.
Hey, you don't want them pickles,
Peepaw said.
The boy here put water in the brine instead of vinegar, and ruined enough product to have him as a slave labor until he's a man.
Peepaw snapped his fingers.
Get the sheriff 4 of the garlic and 4 of the missus likes okra, right?
The sheriff nodded.
4 of the okra. Mild?
You know she's got the ulcer.
Mild,
Peepaw concluded, waving Fritz away. Peepaw and the sheriff spoke about the heat while Fritz filled the box with jars of pickles and okra. The sheriff didn't take a step before opening the box and retrieving a jar. He selected a small pickle and ate it in 2 bites. In a satisfied daze, the sheriff got in his cruiser and left. He waved to them with another pickle in his hand. Peepaw and Fritz waved back until the sheriff was gone.
Hurry up with those boxes,
Peepaw told him.
Break another, and you'll be cleaning the tank with your toothbrush.
Every town has the place. An abandoned building, an alleyway, a wooded area, where the bad kids hang out. You know who I mean. The long hairs, metalheads, the druggies. It's where these outsiders go to smoke cigarettes and listen to music. For us, it was the bridge over Boot Creek, the little stream that snaked through town. Boot Creek itself was rarely any more than a muddy ditch, but at the top of the bank there was an area where kids could hang out and make noise and ride their skateboards without the nosy gazes of adults. My friends and I took to calling it Troll Bridge because it was occupied almost all the time by Billy Logan and his crew of pothead screw-ups. Billy was 3 years older than us, but was only 1 grade ahead because he'd been held back twice. I was in the 7th grade, and here was this giant 15-year-old bully running around terrorizing everyone. Don't look so shocked. It was the 80s. Things were just like that. It was a different world back then. Anyway, Billy had grown this sort of scraggly goatee on his chin, and my friend Chad remarked that all that hanging out under the bridge was turning him into a billy goat. My other friend Daniel pointed out that it had been the troll who lived under the bridge, not the goats. I agreed with Daniel that Billy was much more like the troll than the goats. And after that, it was Troll Bridge, not Boot Creek, that we avoided as much as we could. Now, like I said, this was the 80s and things were different back then. Westport is still a tiny town, but back then it wasn't much more than a few cross streets, some churches, the schools, and a few neighborhoods. It was the sort of town that it was really big news, like front page, that they were opening a new gas station on 5th Street. So in the 80s, I lived in a town that was still very much like the idyllic American towns they showed in TV shows from the 50s. The people were pretty religious and very patriotic. There were community events and boosters, and on the 4th of July, everyone in town would drag a cooler to the beach to watch the fireworks display out over the bay. There were no kidnappers or drug cartels, no perverts or traffickers. There was nothing to be afraid of in Westport, except for maybe Satan. But you know, it was the 80s. Everyone was scared of the devil back then. So when it came to things for me to be afraid of, it was pretty much Satan and Billy Logan. And although we were all pretty scared of the devil, Billy Logan was someone we saw every day. The thing was, although he was a giant asshole and I was terrified of the guy, I stood in awe of Billy Logan. Here was a guy who did whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted. Billy dressed in nothing but ripped jeans, black heavy metal t-shirts, and combat boots. His hair was working on being long, with the back hanging somewhat longer than the front. You'd call it a mullet now, but back then, it was what metalhead kids did between figuring out they wanted long hair and actually having it. Occasionally, I'd see him riding around town on his bike, a tweaked-out BMX with mix-and-match parts. Always leaning back, riding without hands, smoking a cigarette. He was always sure to use the other hand to give you the finger if he saw you looking. Now, I realize bullies are created by being bullied, and that the story of Billy Logan was probably a horribly tragic one, full of neglectful parents and cries for help. I know this. Part of me knew it then, too. You had to know this sort of thing was not normal, that kids just didn't go around failing grades and being assholes because they were just naturally that cool. I realized that he probably had a terrible home life and was just acting out. And teachers? If I had to bet what the teachers were all talking about most of the time in that tiny, smoke-filled teacher's lounge, it was Billy Logan. He'd already been left back twice. There was no way this kid was going to college. Any decent grade he made was, in all likelihood, a sympathy mark, if he even bothered to show up for class. So the teachers more or less left him alone, and for what it's worth, he obviously didn't have parents breathing down his neck all the time. Like some throwback version of Tyler Durden, he was free, in all the ways I was not. And I craved that freedom. Another reason I took a shine to Billy Logan was because of the way Amy Martin looked at him the day he rode his skateboard through the cafeteria at lunchtime. I'd had a crush on Amy since the 5th grade and had nearly gotten up the nerve to ask her to the dance before hearing through the grapevine that she'd already been asked. Amy had an older brother that kept her informed of what was cool. She knew about music and books that we'd never heard of before. She had this sort of maturity, this sophistication that set her apart from the other girls in class. She was also really, really pretty. So brave or not, I knew chances were slim that I'd ever have a shot at a date with her. I was standing in the line with Chad and Daniel when the door to the cafeteria slammed open with a loud bang. Startled, everyone turned to see what had happened. There was Billy, riding his board, hands raised in the heavy metal devil horn salute. He coasted to the center of the room and did a 360-degree spin before stopping and kicking the board into his hand. He looked around dramatically, and in his best Geoff Spicoli voice said, "Hey, there's no birthday party for me here." Everybody laughed and watched as Billy began to make his way to the exit, being flanked on both sides by angry lunchroom monitors. He faked left and bolted right, slipping just under Coach Holden's reaching fingers, and then kicked open the door to the courtyard. When he realized he was free, he stuck a middle finger in the air before hitting that final door that opened to the parking lot. As the door swung shut, we could hear him cackling as he ran away. The cafeteria was abuzz with excitement. Billy had been bad before, but nobody had ever done something so outright crazy. Some people were shaking their heads in exasperation. Others were discussing how the school might go about punishing him when he came back on Monday. One thing's for certain. The only thing anyone was talking about was Billy Logan and the stunt he'd just pulled. Chad and Daniel guessed he'd finally be expelled, and we would be over the terror of Troll Bridge. I wasn't listening to any of it. You see, I'd only been watching Billy out of the corner of my eye. When he'd entered the room, I'd been sneaking glances at Amy Martin. I'd seen her reaction to his antics, and her reaction was anything but exasperation, anger, or pity. No, hers was a serious interest. I realized that she was watching him like I was watching her. Amy liked Billy Logan. She must have felt me watching her because she turned to look at me. I turned away for a second and looked back. Amy was watching Billy again. I decided then and there that I needed to be friends with Billy Logan. Somehow, I thought, he could show me how to be cool and whimsical and free like he was. Girls like bad boys? Fine. I was going to learn from the baddest of them all. The following Friday, when Chad invited me and Daniel over to his house after school, I declined, saying my dad was making me do a bunch of chores. What I really had planned was to head down to Troll Bridge and see if I could borrow a cigarette from Billy. Now, I want you to realize I wasn't lonely or weird or nerdy or any of those things. Although I probably was all those things without being aware of it. Most of my class had been together since kindergarten, and everyone's parents knew each other. There weren't any real out-groups at our little school. There simply weren't enough students for that. But that was the thing. Everyone was so boringly normal that any deviation was just so incredibly interesting. I wonder sometimes if Billy's antics would have been received in the same way at a larger school in a city somewhere. Our school, it seemed, was just unable to deal with a delinquent like him. And whether it was good or bad, it got everyone's attention. Me? If I ever tried to pull anything even sort of silly, my folks would have my ass. My dad was former military and super strict. He had traveled the world and knew more than all the pansies out there. There was one correct way to do everything, and anything other than that way was not only wrong, but almost personally insulting to him somehow. He was a man of very few words, who always had his nose in a book, and most of the time that book was the Bible. My mother was also quite strict and Spartan, if not just a little gentler than my dad. And hell, I'm probably not even being fair. Mom used to tell me that Dad had a hard time during the war, that he'd seen horrible things that he couldn't even talk about. So, I guess they were doing the best they could with what they had. They were strict as hell, though. Even in our tiny town where nothing ever happened and nothing ever went wrong, I had a 7 o'clock curfew, 8 on weekends. I had to call and check in all the time, and when friends were getting together for sleepovers or campouts, I was almost never allowed to go. Even when I was allowed, Mom would have to call and check and double-check with everybody's parents before I got permission. As elementary school gave way to junior high, I had expected the shackles to be loosened a bit, but so far, no such luck. I was wrapped just as tightly in parental supervision as I'd ever been, and every day, my resentment was growing. As I watched Billy burst out of those doors with his middle finger in the air, as I watched a kid flaunt complete and total disregard for authority and rules and parents, and pretty much everything else, and, well, just walk away scot-free, I had to be part of this. I had to find out how he did it. I needed to know how not to give a shit. Not in the way that everyone else did. I needed to be Billy Logan's friend. I needed to be a badass who didn't give a fuck what people thought. I needed to find out what went on under that goddamned bridge. The following Friday, I said goodbye to my friends with as much false sincerity as I could muster. Yes, it sucked so much. Yeah, it was going to be hot and stupid. But that was Dad and his arbitrary chore assignment. Yeah, I'd see everyone on Monday. Well, unless I saw them at church, but yeah. See you Monday. I hitched my backpack up and headed across the football field and through the alley behind the grocery store. I stopped there to buy a soft drink for the bridge, then decided to grab a second, just in case Billy wanted one. It was a strange walk out to Boot Creek Bridge. I no longer wanted to think of it as Troll Bridge, now that I was going to be one of its occupants. We weren't bad people. We were just misunderstood. We liked music and skateboards, and there wasn't anything wrong with that. Did we like beer and cigarettes? Well, admittedly, I'd had neither. But hell yeah, we smoked and drank. It was just what we did. And if you didn't like it, you could just go on home. I imagined myself dressed in ripped jeans and black t-shirt, playing guitar in a band, while Billy screamed to the world that heavy metal had landed in Westport, and everyone who didn't like it could fuck off. I actually played air guitar as I walked across the video store parking lot. This was real. This was going to happen. I just need to get and learn to play a guitar, and we'd be on MTV by this time next year. I crossed over 7th and made my way onto Country Road 9. I'd made sure to stay far to the side to keep from getting hit by the crazies who treated 9 as their own private racetrack. It wasn't far, only a couple hundred yards to the bridge. I'd crossed it hundreds of times on my way to and from school. There was nothing special or interesting or scary about it. Except this was Troll Bridge. Billy Gruff Troll Logan was under there, and I had come to meet him. I had come to face the monster. And not only that, I was going to try and tame him enough to make friends with me, to play heavy metal, a subject I knew the square root of fuck all about. Under there was a kid who shined off teachers and parents alike. Grown-ups had nothing on him. All of their power, strength, and authority meant nothing. The monster under the bridge was beyond the control of any adult, and adults were the place where kids like me placed all their hope and trust to keep things safe and normal. Billy Logan spit on all that and laughed at everyone's attempts to even try. And here I was, with an extra can of Dr. Pepper, and thinking I'd be able to tame the beast. I hesitated at the place where the asphalt met the dirt, and clustered sticker burrs swayed in the southeast Texas breeze. What the hell was I thinking? I leaned on the guardrail and thought back over my plan. I would go down there, act like life had just been too much to bear, and pretend like I was supposed to be there. If there was any conversation, I'd just shake my head and pretend like my problems were just too much to talk about. I would ask for a cigarette, then lean against the wall and talk to Billy Logan, man to man. Once we got to talking, I'd go for the gold. Rambo was the biggest movie at the time, and it just so happened that my uncle had taken my cousin Thomas and me to see it. Afterward, on the way through the mall to his car, we stopped into the knife store, and he bought us both official Rambo survival knives. I remember being so excited on the drive home. Thomas and I sitting in the back seat, comparing identical blades. It was nearly a foot long, with a sharp blade on one side, and a saw or something on the other. The handle had a compass on the end, and you could unscrew it to get all the cool stuff hidden inside. There were fish hooks and sewing needles, a handful of matches and a strike strip, some fishing line and thread for the needle. The sheath even had a compartment in front for a little blue sharpening stone. When I had this knife, I felt prepared for anything. Well, anything except for my father. When we got home that day, I left my new knife on the back seat of my uncle's car. Thomas and I ran to the backyard while my uncle talked to my dad. I have no idea what they talked about, except that a while after they left, Dad came into my room holding my survival knife and said we needed to talk.
"Son,"
he said, scratching the bridge of his nose.
"Your Uncle Darren told me he bought you and Thomas a present."
I just looked at him before shrugging. He looked uncomfortable.
It's just that.
He paused and looked around. Anywhere but at me.
It's that I think a boy needs a good knife. I'd been meaning to get you one myself.
Shocked, I turned to him. So, it's all right? His normally serious gaze turned to a smile.
Of course it is. I just want to make sure you know how to use it. A knife, any knife, but especially one as big as this one, needs to be treated with respect. Can I trust you to keep it clean and sharp and put away when it's not in use?
Yes, sir. I hopped up off the bed and gave him a hug. And to my surprise, he hugged me back.
I'm serious, son,
he said again.
The fastest way you'll get into trouble is to go around doing stupid things with stupid people. I want that knife either on your belt or on the top shelf of your closet. Do not take it anywhere you could get into trouble for it. No school, no church, no nothing. You can use it here in the backyard, and that's about it. Okay? We'll go camping soon, and you can do what you like, but until then, please keep it put away. Okay?
I had been shocked, but also just so damn happy. It had been the first time I could think of that my old man spoke to me like I was a man, and not some little kid. I kept my word, too. I'd kept it on the shelf when I wasn't camping. It was the least I could do to keep my prize. Today, however, I had gone the other way. Today, that knife was stuffed between the soda cans in the front pocket of my backpack. Today, if soft drinks and small talk didn't work, I would prove to Billy that I could be cool. After all, only cool people would have a knife like mine, right? Or rather, only cool people would have the nerve to carry it around in their backpack at school. I would show him the knife, and he would think I was cool. And I'd be allowed into the gang, and that would be that. It couldn't fail. I hesitated a moment before hitching up my pack and walking down the sandy embankment on the side of the bridge. Just a few feet off the road, in a spot that was not visible from up there, were many layers of spray paint in different colors. I couldn't make out what most of it said, as it was painted over itself and nearly impossible to read. There were the names of bands, such as Slayer and Iron Maiden, among others. Most of these I failed to recognize. Further down, the graffiti got heavier, and I could make out swastikas and little phrases that I imagined were song lyrics. Among these phrases, more prominent than the others, were the phrases, "Hail Satan," and "God is dead." For whatever reason, the "Hail Satan" message didn't bother me, but "God is dead" gave me pause. Not for the first time, I thought I was making a mistake, and should just turn and go home.
The hell are you?
A voice called from under the bridge. I took a few more steps, then followed the voice. Billy Logan was sitting against the concrete embankment, smoking a cigarette and reading a magazine. To say he looked surprised to see me was an understatement. He regarded me carefully.
Who's with you? What do you want?
Nobody's with me. I came by myself. I sighed and tried to play cool. It's just been one of those days. Teachers all on my ass. Needed to come and think. Billy just watched me as I walked around considering the graffiti. He set his magazine down and leaned forward, his arms hugging his knees, then stood up slowly. I didn't know what to make of him moving like that. He almost seemed like a cat ready to pounce. I'd expected him to say something, but he didn't. This wasn't going well. I gestured to a cigarette. Mind if I get one of those? He exhaled a giant plume of smoke through his nose before reaching into his shirt pocket and tossing me a stick. Of course, it fell short, and I had to walk over to pick it up. I looked at it for a second, then put it between my lips. I then patted my pockets as if looking for a lighter we both knew I didn't have. "Got a light?" Rolling his eyes, he produced a Zippo and tossed it as well. But I caught it this time. I flipped the top and struck it, puffing on my first ever cigarette, getting it lit before closing the lid and tossing the lighter back to him. I took a mouthful of smoke and blew it into the air. I looked at the cigarette and back to Billy. Camel. I haven't had one of these before." I shrugged. "It's good." Billy narrowed his eyes and moved away from me. He knew I was full of shit. Knew that I didn't smoke. He knew that I didn't belong here. The only thing he wasn't sure of yet was why. Why was I here? What did I want? He walked over and stood over a rusted oil drum, the kind you see in movies being used as a fireplace by homeless people. He kicked it a couple times. It made a deep ringing sound that echoed loudly off the concrete that surrounded us. He still stared at me and said nothing. His silence was suddenly terrifying. I started to say something, thought better of it, then remembered the cigarette in my hand and brought it up for another puff.
"That's not how you do it, dweeb,"
he said.
"You pull it into your mouth, then you inhale it like this."
He took a drag, inhaled, then let it out in a slow exhale.
"What's a kid your age doing smoking anyway? What are you, 12?
I hesitated before answering. 13, actually. I mean, almost. In a few weeks I'll be 13. The cigarette burned between my fingers, and I tried again, following Billy's instructions. My biggest fear was that I would start coughing. I didn't. What happened was I was immediately dizzy. I felt nauseated. Something was wrong. I looked up at Billy through teary eyes, and he laughed.
"Jesus, kid, you're pretty fucking stupid."
The nausea soon passed, but was replaced by a keening headache. I had no idea why. My only guess was that I had somehow smoked the cigarette incorrectly. Too fast or too much at once. Either way, I was pretty miserable now. The feeling was made worse by the laughing bully I'd come down here to impress. I tossed the cigarette away and turned to leave. This whole thing had been a mistake. People like this, places like this, they were all out of my league. Girls like Amy Martin were just as unattainable. I would just have to accept that. I took a few steps back toward the road when something crashed into me from behind. My knees buckled, and I went down on my face and stomach on the concrete.
"Where are you going, kiddo?"
Billy laughed as he pulled my right arm up behind me and pinned it against my backpack. The pain was so sudden and so immense, I barely had time to register what had happened. Billy was dragging me to my feet by very nearly ripping my arm out of its socket. I screamed as I staggered up and then forward, my arm being used to steer my body. He walked me to the oil drum and then stopped.
"You owe me a cigarette, asshole,"
he said.
"I think there's one in there. Go get it."
And with that, he shoved my head into the drum. He pushed and pulled until I was inverted in the can, my arm now pinned between my backpack and my steel prison. He then lifted my legs, and gravity pulled me to the bottom of the can, where my head and left arm splashed into a nasty slush of rancid water and wet cigarette butts. The odor of this and whatever else was in that liquid immediately made me throw up, and now I was covered in that too. I used my left arm to try to push myself out, but it was no use. I was stuck fast. And even if I wasn't able to do a one-handed inverted push-up, even when I wasn't covered in vomit and shit water. It was completely dark. Whichever way I was situated in the barrel, there was no light. I could not move, and as my body settled, either through relaxing muscles or gravity pulling me, I felt myself getting stuck even tighter than before. I kicked my legs frantically, hoping to throw the can off balance so maybe I could crawl out. No such luck. Then Billy must have kicked the can, because I was assailed with a tremendous noise that rattled my teeth. He kicked it a few more times, and each time was just as bad as the first. Then everything went quiet. The quiet was the worst part. The quiet was where I could begin to think about what had happened to me. All at once, the walls of my prison began to close in on me. Everything that had been black in the darkness went a sudden and stark white. I was going to die. I knew now. Nobody knew where I was. I was stuck in this barrel, my arm losing feeling. Billy could just leave me here, and there was forever and always. Nothing I could do about it. My body slid another half-inch into the barrel, and my neck turned at an odd angle. This was it. My stupid, stupid self. I tried one more time, kicking, pushing, screaming. Every ounce of energy pushed as hard as I could against a captor that could not yield. Breathing was becoming difficult with the way my body pressed on my neck. I tried again to shift a little, just to help myself breathe. But it was no use. I could not move. Then something happened. I wiggled the fingers on my pinned right hand, and when I did, something in my backpack shifted. I had an idea. If I could somehow shift the contents of my bag, it might make enough room for me to slip out of the barrel. I didn't have time to think about it. It was my only hope. I began to probe the pack with the limited range of motion I had. There, right next to my thumb, was a zipper. I worked my fingers until I moved the zipper enough to make a hole. Then I pulled the compartment open. One of the soda cans fell out, landed with a splash next to my head. Using my hand to push on the inside of the compartment, I inhaled and pushed, and the second can fell out as well. I then gripped the handle of my knife and pulled it free of the bag. When I relaxed, I slid further into the can, but my right arm came free, and I was able to throw the barrel off balance and knock it over. I scrambled out of the barrel and onto the sandy concrete under the Boot Creek Bridge. I gasped for air, and then choked. Giant, hacking, choking coughs followed as I rolled over and coughed up a cigarette butt. Then I threw up again, although this time there was nothing left but bile. I sat there a moment, on my knees, trying to focus, trying to see, trying to make sense of anything at all. My ears were still ringing from when the barrel had been kicked. My eyes, nose, and mouth were full of vomit and shit water. I glanced up to see the shape of Billy Logan approaching me. He appeared to be smiling and had a hand out. I needed to run, to escape, to get away. He had done this to me. He hadn't meant for me to escape. He was going to put me back in there, back in the barrel. I scrambled backward as he came toward me. I looked to my left and then to my right, and then I noticed I was holding my knife. I quickly popped the snap and pulled it from its sheath. I then held it in both hands and lunged at Billy Logan and sunk its blade, all 10 inches of stainless china, into his belly. Billy's eyes went wide as I stabbed him. He screamed and staggered backward, taking the knife with him as the blade slipped from my hands. He tried to pull it from his stomach, but the inverted saw teeth on the back side of the blade held it in. A blackish red stain appeared on his Iron Maiden t-shirt, and he fell to his knees. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a blubbering, nonsensical slur and a pained hiss. He then toppled over and rolled down the embankment into the littered ditch that was Boot Creek. He landed on his back, the handle of the knife now laying flat against his stomach. I thought for a second of all the damage that thing must have done as it got knocked side to side and up and down as he tumbled. He kicked a time or two, weakly, in the wet scrabble of trash at the bottom of the ditch, then went still. What had I done? Oh my God, what had just happened? Adrenaline and panic rose, almost as badly as it had been in the bottom of the barrel. Bile rose in my throat, and I threw up for the third time that afternoon. What now? Should I call the police? Should I just run away? I should get help. That's what I should do. But what help? I was no doctor, but I imagined a 10-inch blade making random cuts inside the body cavity of a person. There was no help for Billy Logan. The kid was dead. If not now, then definitely by the time I could find someone and bring them back. I should just run. Go out to the train yards and hop on the first one going anywhere. I would just live as a man on the run, telling stories to younger men about the dangers of bridges and trolls. I shook off the thought.
What are you, 12?
Billy's voice in my head. I was just 12, and I had just stabbed a guy to death. What kind of prison do they send a 12-year-old murderer to? Certainly not juvie, the place they send shoplifters and vandals. No, my prison, the one for murderers, it had to be, much worse. It was full of kids just like Billy Logan, except no. Logan might have been a dick, but he was no killer. So it was full of kids that were even meaner than Billy Logan. I shuddered. I could not go to prison. Not for this. This was an accident. This was self-defense. This was retaliation. Anyone could see my clothes and know that he had it coming. I was a good kid with good grades. My father was a decorated war veteran. Billy Logan was a piece of shit criminal who once tried to set the school on fire. If anything, I had done everyone, including myself, a favor. I looked back at the now still body with the giant knife poking out of it, and I knew that I was kidding myself. All the judge would have to ask was why I had that knife with me, and why I had chosen to go under the bridge in the first place. Billy Logan had terrorized me in some way, and I had gone down there seeking revenge. He had fought me, but in the end, the one with the huge knife used it to murder the harmless prankster. The gavel would come down and I would be escorted out in chains to spend the rest of my life among dangerous and violent criminals. I had to cover this up, had to conceal it. I had to get rid of the body. Thunder pealed off in the distance to herald a coming storm. I stared at the body for a long time, daring myself to move. I knew that when I began to move, whatever I did, and whatever the results were, they were permanent. I was dealing with forever here, and as the storm got closer, I knew my time was running out. How was I going to get rid of him? I looked around for an answer. Then I found it. The barrel. I would shove him in and close the top somehow. When Boot Creek came up with the runoff from the storm, Billy, barrel and all, would be washed out into the bay. Flushed away. Gone, gone, gone. I could think of no other solution. so I got to work. I took off my backpack and stashed it high on the bank, then rolled the barrel down into the ditch. The echoing noise it made as it bounced off the concrete was deafening, and I was sure that someone was going to hear and investigate. I couldn't worry about that. I ran down and pulled the knife from Billy's belly. The saw teeth held chunks of flesh and gore that I'd have to scrub to get off. But for now, I needed to hide the knife as well. Then if anyone came along, I could say I found him like this. I was just trying to get him out, rather than into the barrel. I rolled the open end to his head, and then lifted his head and shoulders into the can. He was heavier than I thought he'd be, and I wasn't sure if I was strong enough to get the job done. I was also creeped out by his half-lidded eyes. I half expected him to jump up and grab me like a killer in a monster movie. I hoped he would even. But I knew he would not. He was dead, and I had to get him into this barrel. I worked the barrel from side to side and inched the body into it little by little. Once I got a little past his hips, his head hit the bottom of the can, and I couldn't get the rest of him in. I sat there for a second thinking. When I'd been upside down in the barrel, my neck had turned. And when it did, my body had shifted and more of me had fallen in. I needed to use gravity to help. I went to the open end of the barrel and tried lifting it, but it was too heavy. Then I bent Billy's knees and tried to shove them in. One of them caught on the side of the can, and it made it easier for me to get a grip. I held on to the side of that barrel and pushed with all my strength. Harder and harder than I had ever tried to do anything before, and little by little, the barrel righted itself, and the body of Billy Logan slipped further inside. Once I was done folding the other leg and pushing the corpse in, the barrel was only about 3/4 full. I thought about how to close the top. The rain was closer now. I could smell it in the air along with the sludge and cigarettes from the barrel. The creek was flowing a bit more than it had been as well. I needed to hurry. How would I close this thing? There was no lid. Then I saw one of the Dr. Pepper cans that had fallen from my backpack. It had fallen out and rolled down here with us, and the top had been crushed somehow in all the confusion. I had a flash of inspiration and cast about looking for as big a rock as I could find. I found what I needed and set to work collapsing the top of the barrel on 2 sides. I then hammered the sides in, basically sealing the top by crushing the top in on him. If I was lucky, the barrel would float away, maybe as far as the bay. And by the time they found the body, there would be nothing left to connect me to it in any way. As the rain began to fall around Boot Creek Bridge, I left the barrel and the worst mistake I'd ever made behind. I collected my backpack and my knife. I wondered about the spots of blood that glistened here and there on the concrete, but as the water began to flow down the sides of the culvert, I was comfortable that it would wash away. And even if it didn't, it would blend with the swastikas and other graffiti down there. God is dead, indeed. I walked home in the rain, very slowly. I needed the water to wash me clean. I stopped behind the car wash and rinsed the blood and chunks off the knife. I would take a toothbrush to it later, but this would do for now. I cried as I worked. For the first time since Billy had attacked me, I'd been able to actually think about what had happened. A series of full-bodied shudders shook me, and I cried from my core. I cried for myself and what was going to happen when they found me. I imagined the looks on my parents' faces, my grandparents. I cried for my teachers and my friends, and everyone I'd let down by doing this stupid stunt. Strangely enough, though, I didn't cry for Billy Logan. I could still feel the wet, nasty cigarette butt lodged in my throat. No. Although I cried for many, many things on that walk home, Billy Logan got none of my tears. When I got home, Dad was still at work, and Mom's car was gone, meaning she was out running errands. And that meant I had time. I was completely drenched and fully exhausted, and the entire contents of my backpack were thoroughly soaked. I took out the knife and shoved it into my pants before dropping the bag in the laundry room and going to my room. I set the knife in its spot on my closet shelf and peeled my clothes off, running to dump them into the washing machine. Then I got into the shower and scrubbed my entire body, over and over again, with the hottest water I could stand. When I was done, I brushed my teeth longer and harder than I ever had before, or since. Then I started over again. In the days that come, every phrase that anyone uttered scared me. I assumed that any second, someone would call my name, and there would be a cop waiting to take me in. I was a murderer, after all. In English class, we'd been studying Poe's story, The Telltale Heart. Of course we were. I sat quietly as that heart beat in that crawl space, and that killer gave himself up to the cops. I felt like I was being tested, like they knew it was me and were giving me a chance to give myself up. I started to wonder if cops got bigger paychecks if the criminals confessed, because they didn't have to pay the lawyers as much. Well, I was going to make them work for it. I wasn't going to say a word until I had no other choice. Even if they put me in chains and took me away, I'd never tell anyone what I'd done. I tried to convince myself it had just been a horrible dream anyway, and that Billy Logan would come bursting through that door any minute, middle fingers blazing. I knew he wouldn't, of course, but I hoped. It was a full 5 days before anyone reported Billy missing. Apparently his attendance at home had been just as sporadic as at school. Nobody even realized he was gone for almost a week. When the first missing person sign showed up on the bulletin board in the cafeteria, I just about fainted. People talked, of course. There were rumors. I listened to whoever was talking about what they'd heard. Billy had run away. He had a drug problem and owed a dealer. He moved to California to start a band. He got kidnapped by Satanists. He moved to California with a bunch of Satanists to start a band. I relaxed a little as each one of these stories came out. At least none of them claimed to have seen Billy getting his guts pulverized by a 12-year-old dork under Boot Creek Bridge. Days turned to weeks, and weeks to months. The local police had never liked that kid, and were probably just happy he had moved on. Everyone pretty much agreed that he had just run away from home. His mom showed up at city council meetings and swore that if he'd just run away, he would have at least called her by now. But she was a mean drunk who had punched a cop in front of the Dixie Mart on Christmas Eve, so they didn't like her either. The missing person signs faded, and with them, the memory of Billy Logan. I turned 13 without having been caught. Then 14. My folks moved from Westport to Dallas, then from Dallas to Tallahassee. I graduated high school, then college, and went on to have a family and a career in a city and state I'd rather not mention. In the end, nobody put much effort into finding Billy Logan. Not much effort at all. I suppose that when all was said and done, he wasn't someone I needed to be friends with. After all.
After World War II, Russian agents descended upon German specialists habituating in the Soviet occupation zone and forcefully deported them to the USSR to work on their own scientific projects. This maneuver, dubbed Operation Osseoviakum, included renowned astrophysicist Dr. Dietrich Volkov. He performed cosmonautical operations for the Soviets for nearly 17 years before the United States acquired his person during Operation Paperclip. Prior to his employment at NASA, he was debriefed by the National Reconnaissance Office regarding the Soviets' more covert scientific advancements. The following is the first of many accounts Dr. Volkov delivered during the nearly 10-hour interrogation, transcribed and condensed for clarity. Have never set foot on a battlefield. I've never embraced a firearm, but those times where I was were more warlike than I could ever have imagined. Being ripped from your family, subjected to forced labor for a greater cause, treated as though you had merely been away on holiday. It was jarring, manic. But I would be lying if I said my sentiments during those times had shifted much. The Russians, they had once more made America their enemy, and pretending as though my animosity aligned with theirs was not difficult, that made the work bearable. In my downtrodden state, the babble regarding the so-called space race seemed masturbatory, akin to school children stacking towers of blocks to see whose would reach the highest without toppling. Between them, they must have sent a small zoo's worth of animals into space. Putting a man on the moon? Yesterday, Le Voyage dans la Lune was the public's idea of lunar exploration. Now, they speak of it with excitement, in clean, modernized terms, as if it's happening tomorrow. I envy their purity. We were cursed with progress. We had not the time to dwell on the implications of our successes. You might think sending up Yuri Gagarin would have been the proper moment to step back, to take a breather. It was not. And it was that attitude that led to the downward spiraling of some of these endeavors. Look through your telescopes. Look at the expanse of space. Observe all the stars, all the galaxies, held together in harmony. Take a visual snapshot with your mind. Now, consider this. From that snapshot alone, it would be impossible for all those bodies to remain in their proper places without flying into the void. Therefore, something must be holding them together, filling the gaps to ensure that our universe does not spiral out of control. Dark matter, it was dubbed, made tangible, ironically, by intangible measures, gravity, mathematics. How would we even begin conceptualizing the lexicon to convey it in a meaningful manner? Developing the tools necessary? Offshooting the branches of science requisite to bust through a wall of nothingness? We haven't, and we won't. Not any time soon. And judging from what happened early on, that might be for the better. The first organisms in space started out small. Fruit flies, mosses, fungi. The jump to more complicated animals was not without its casualties. So many mice, primates, dogs were lost in those years, enough to make even a scientist cringe. Among the early launches were cockroaches. It made sense. They're resilient to many of space's harshest conditions. They are easy to store and keep viable. And they're easy to find, too. They were so abundant in our quarters. My fellow Germans would make jokes, telling our captors we were harboring gypsies in our bunks, only for them to be greeted with a colony of the ugly scuttling things. Such playfulness was not appreciated, if you have already guessed. It was quashed with swift efficiency. Our first satellites either failed en route, or their cockroach crew did not survive their round trip. We sent up 11 of them, each containing their unique hive. 1 through 7 went catastrophic. 9 through 11 were resounding successes. It was 8 that eventually yielded the anomalous results. Only 2 specimens survived, 2 Periplaneta americana were named Harry and Rosie. Once it was discovered they were alive in their capsules, they were sent away immediately for further testing. I was asked to oversee further developments, thanks to my biology credits in university. I guess those extra years in academia had amounted to something, after all. Harry and Rosie were kept in separate receptacles deep underground to minimize the impact of cosmic rays. Those first few days they displayed lethargic behavior, loss of appetite, and delayed reaction times. It was disconcerting. The implication that even the hardiest creatures would have trouble adapting to outer space conditions. Regardless, I was instructed to continue monitoring them until their death. Sacrilegious and hypocritical as it was, I found myself praying for their death to come. After 5 days, Harry and Rosie displayed signs of vitality once more. They were readily accepting food, and when we were late in our providing, they would chew on the styrofoam egg cartons in their receptacles. This was not a concerning habit. Cockroaches are well known for their ubiquitous diet. Otherwise, their movements were erratic, aimless. They were not exploring their environments as cockroaches are apt to do. Neither did they react to the typical stimuli, like sudden changes in light. Even early on, it was speculated that exposure to rogue waves had addled their physiologies. Where it would all go was anyone's guess, but my job was to deliver answers, not to guess. I maintained my observations. It was at day 16 when I noticed the aberrations. Harry and Rosie each displayed asymmetric patches of discoloration within their exoskeletons, similar to bruising on melanosis, the latter of which I named in my subsequent report. For obvious reasons, both my peers and superiors were dissatisfied with my hypothesis. Neither cockroach had molted in over 2 months, meaning nothing could have happened during those vulnerable in-between times. Chitin, the structural component in exoskeletons, also does not allow for such spontaneous pigmentation. At that point, dissection was an option thrown our way, but at that point I refused. If the affliction killed them anyway, there would be no need to cut our observation phase short. It would be pertinent to know if their condition was the result of space-related malignant tumors. A pertinent piece of knowledge by any stretch. At least that's what I told them. The strangeness only compounded the deeper I dug. For one, the discoloration did not seem to either refract or absorb light. This became apparent as I examined Rosie underneath a microscope and thought I or someone had capped the lens until Rosie twitched, and my eye was met with the glowing, intricate brick red of exoskeleton. As I came to find, I didn't even need a microscope to become further perturbed. Even in low light, the spots stood out like black on white. Prolonged eye contact with the patches resulted in some troubling side effects. When I blinked, their dark shapes swam in my vision, like a Rorschach inkblot test burned behind the skin of my eyelids. And if I were to lock my gaze, I experienced a swooping sensation, nausea in my eyes and upheaval in my gut, as if I wanted to fall. The colors seemed bottomless, like a hellish pit, like there was something brooding beyond, hiding in the darkness, something I wanted and something I feared. For obvious reasons, all these I kept to myself. The Soviets were cruel and calculating in weeding out weak links, and I had no desire to give an excuse for them to cart me off. And regardless, such fanciful projection is antithetical to the pursuit of science. I had to focus on my work, to not get lost in postulations. It's no surprise that cockroaches leave behind droppings. It's a constant reminder of their tenacious appetites. They use them to communicate, to mark where they've been. So I thought very little of it when I saw their receptacles had been reupholstered with their feces. It was when Harry tried attacking a pair of forceps I introduced to the receptacle, gnawing the tips like how a dog gnaws at a bone, that I grew concerned. It was predatory behavior, the need to consume. With dissection still not an option, I guessed analyzing their droppings might yield some clues. I sectioned them off and attempted to collect samples, but to my confusion, I found roughly 90% of the droppings would simply not dislodge from the receptacle's surface. The 10% that I was able to collect showed no signs of abnormalities. I was able to conclude I was collecting old samples, left before Harry and Rosie developed their afflictions. As for the other 90, despite my best efforts, microscopic analysis of the tip of the scraper I used registered nothing. In fact, the tool seemed coated with a fine, translucent dust ink. Only later did I comprehend that it was glass. I had been chipping away at the glass floor and sidings of the receptacles. It was confounding. I was certain I was making contact with the droppings, yet it appeared as though my tool had simply passed through them and made contact with the glass. Now I realize what was really happening there, now that there's a name to it. In that time, though, my curiosity only piqued, plummeting through the eternal cosmic chasms in the insect's shells. I became protective of my work, single-minded. I couldn't help it. Soviet ideology did not allow for such secrecy, and my introversion only made them more insistent. I convinced them that foreign bodies in the sample area might disrupt the integrity of the insect's development. Unnecessary stress, outside chemicals. All that was, as you say, horseshit. Harry and Rosie had become their own unique entities. Nothing could have swayed their path. They were hell-bent in their subconscious quest to defy our expectations. I gladly went along for the ride. Their impalpable droppings continued to pile up, and I observed with private fascination how their appetites grew, how their unorthodox behavior continued to evolve in its bizarre sideways skew. For the moment, I had forgotten the implications of these findings, that our own cosmonauts might develop similar conditions. But although they had enslaved me to put their own men in space, I was serving myself. Dietrich Volkov oversees these bold new uber-roaches, not the Soviets. Once I broke free from their bondage, I would scream my discoveries to the world. Harry and Rosie were my partners in crime. The pebbles I would toss to make ripples in the pond. It may sound juvenile now, but I wish they had seen it the same way. I wish they had cooperated with my human pretensions. Isn't that the dream? The universe cooperating with our human pretensions. It is pretension that ensures the dream, ironically. I'm no God-fearing man, but even I know when the time is ripe to sit back and let the universe speak for itself. Miracles, yes, but one at a time. It can wait. We cannot, and that's a travesty. But I digress. After the second week, I found that Harry appeared to be missing from his receptacle. I knew all too well that cockroaches' propensity to hiding, yet he was nowhere to be seen after my exhaustive combing. I first assumed that someone had moved him during one of my off periods, but after querying my supervisors, I learned that not only was a deportation not officially authorized, but I was the only one to frequent the room since last contact. This naturally led to accusations of sabotage. Repeating my claims in my head only became more ludicrous each time. You have stolen Soviet property and are planning to smuggle it to our enemies. Right. I stole a space travel-addled cockroach and planned to sell it to the Americans. They would pay top dollar for an insect. At least it would be cheap to feed and keep. A lot of things the Russians were, but trusting they were not. Tensions rose until I uncovered Harry's new whereabouts. But the revelation did not bring relief. On the contrary, it nearly floored me with shock and awe. Harry was in Rosie's receptacle. As I mentioned before, cockroaches' ability to squeeze through spaces thin as a sheet of paper has made them pioneers of survival and endurance. But the same technology to keep our spacecraft airtight was employed to ensure the integrity of their pens. Not even an atom could have made its way inside. There had to have been a breach in the glass. Again, the Soviets were quick to blame me for the transgression. Ironic that proving the truth of my innocence required the reasonable explanation of a physically impossible feat. I was frustrated and scared. I knew they would take no more excuses. I had to figure out the source, to plunge even deeper down the dark well I'd sprung. My attention was drawn to the droppings, which had proliferated so greatly I bothered not with them at a point. How they seemed to defy my attempts to study them. How matters seemed to pass through them. Then it hit me. Once more, my assumptions proved to be correct, although I did not want it to be. By focusing on the spots where large amounts of droppings had gathered, I could insert the tip of the scraper through the outside of the glass wall and end up inside the receptacle. Whatever new, strange material was in their feces could somehow interact with the solid glass and annihilate it, delete it from existence. Harry had squeezed through the freshly formed gap to be with Rosie, and with such primitive-minded creatures, I could only imagine one reason they had to break from their pens and unite. I had not the words to properly convey what had happened, and the Soviets had not the understanding to accept my inability to do so. I was placed on probation. Harry and Rosie were formally moved to new receptacles, and the explanation my peers and I chalked up, corrosion to the glass via some form of noxious secretion, was good enough for our superiors. Any self-respecting entomologist would have rolled his eyes at that, but compliance was the only thing keeping me from harsher punishment after that incident. I dared not speak out, even with any earnest warning that Harry might have impregnated Rosie. If their droppings had done something so radical as to annihilate solid matter, imagine what their offspring might be capable of. By the time my probation was up, I was anxious to check back on Harry and Rosie. Their new receptacles were deeper underground, downgraded to cramped tubular holes in the wall that even a lowly cockroach would have frowned upon. I knew exactly what I was looking for when I went to check on Rosie to see if things had changed. She had deposited an ootheca, which had adhered to the tube's plastic siding. Periplaneta americana's egg cases are typically a caramel brown color. This ootheca, however, was pitch black, the same shineless hue of the splotches on the parents' exoskeletons. This was a remarkable and untoward development. Whatever they had been exposed to out in space had infected their genes, enough to pass on to their kin, and if the nymphs were viable, there was no telling how they would turn out. The black ootheca was compelling enough to finally attract outside attention, and upon my next report, Harry and Rosie had frequent visitors. The theories among those who saw them ranged from the plausible, some form of solar radiation sickness, to the outlandish, being Harry and Rosie didn't exist. They had been replaced by doubles from a parallel universe. If only we knew what we were truly dealing with. Radiation sickness and doppelgangers seem paltry compared to what we know now. I had long taught myself at that point not to let anything surprise me regarding the insects, yet it still was a surprise to see that the nymphs had hatched in 3 days. Cockroach nymphs are pure white when they're born, leading some people to mistake them for rare albinos. This wasn't the case. They were the same color as their Uthaka, miniature versions of their parents, and at such a large scale compared to the droppings, I could see that they did not cast a shadow. That was the first major indicator for me, that what the parents had inundated in space was something that defied all conventional laws of matter, of physics, of science. Their nymphs existed as wholes in reality, manifestations of things that simply should not be. They swarmed the inside of their tube like interstellar ants, and exactly 1 hour after their birth, they as one converged upon Rosie. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Rosie, despite her affliction, still remained fairly cockroach-like in terms of what she could and could not do. These things held no such distinction. They dug through her shell like a hot knife through butter, and I watched the poor bug rupture from the inside, her pus-colored viscera exploding from her offspring's burrows, her extremities twitching as if electrocuted. Then she stilled and collapsed entirely, as if sublimating into thin air. There was a frame, a rosy-shaped frame, of blackness in her place. Then it broke apart into nymphs, and as they moved they released a veritable trail of the same annihilating droppings, like dragging a pencil tip across paper. I was aghast, completely stupefied about what to do. They would break out. They would escape just like Harry did. And then what the hell would they do? These creatures, the universe was not ready for them, and as I flashed on a bevy of possibilities, one of them did just that. The way it scuttled up the wall in sickening zigzags, it awoke within me a primal animal instinct, our natural squeamish fear of cockroaches. I forgot my place, and like an idiot, I squashed the damn thing with my palm. I didn't expect to crush it, knowing how difficult it is to kill them. I also didn't expect the unbelievable pain, as if a lit cigarette had been thrust into my skin. I reflexively drew my hand back and saw the nymph squirming in a pool of smoking flesh. Then it sank into my hand like a stone through water. The agony that followed was undefinable. My mind had gone blank, drunk with panic. I could only recall the exact sensation afterward. Explosive, like tiny mines rupturing my ligaments and bones. I could feel pints of blood boiling and creeping down my muscles. My hand and forearm turned red and bubbled. Remember, these are all details I gathered later. In that moment, I had burst from the room shrieking like an Alp, yelling to stop the nymphs, to get it out of me. I was apprehended almost immediately. The medics saw the sizzling lesion in my palm and dragged me to a neighboring room, and against my will, they had drawn a scalpel and chiseled it into my flesh. That pain jolted me back to life. It was cold and sharp, almost a welcome relief from the nymph, and they had dislodged it. Blood seeped forth and dripped down like liquid cobwebs, and I watched as the nymph writhed on its back, immobilized. That was the least of my concerns. I looked over to the medics and I spat, "Get to the lab! Stop them!" But they did not understand my German tongue, and it took a brief time for them to get the message. That frenzied minute of incomprehension may have cost us much more than it should have. As they left the room, I tore the gauze from an attendant's grasp and wrapped my hand up to stem the flow of blood, then bolted for the laboratory. By that time, an alarm had gone off at the lab, and the room was lit with beams of crazy red light. But each crimson flare illuminated the terror of what had unfolded. They had all escaped, crawling up the walls, leaving black trails like infected blood vessels, branching underneath skin. I watched, mouth agape, and raptured with horror, as others poured in behind me. My peers did not understand the extent of what was happening. One of them armed himself with an aerosol of formic acid and laid waste to the nymphs. They dropped to the floor immediately, but the chemicals failed to appropriately react, and they scattered, crisscrossing their dark lines toward the gathered crowd. One well-meaning fool stomped on the nymph, an action I was too late to stop. He immediately fell to the floor, his leg twitching, as liquefying flesh shot out from his boot. That was enough to break the crowd, to make them scream and flee from the lab. It was chaos for the next hour. The unfortunate fellow was carted away, and the nymph was chiseled from the bottom of his foot too. My own palm flared with sympathetic agony as I watched him go, strong enough to make me fear that there was another nymph inside me. When we evacuated, the lab was buried. Literal tons of concrete blocks were laid over the premises. Then the hallways were flooded. Then that was sealed again. Then the floor above was collapsed and sealed with liquid lead. We did what we felt we had to do. That's what we told ourselves. None of us wanted to admit it was a cataclysmic, overcompensatory, knee-jerk reaction to something we didn't understand. Harry was lost too, and so we lost the only hope of possibly replicating what we had done. We could have captured them, preserved them, maybe studied them further. Now, what are they doing? Did they become crushed? Were they suffocated? Are they continuing to thrive? Will they emerge from the ruins after so long to continue to chew holes? And if so, what will become of the surface world we all know and live in? It didn't end there. There's another piece of trivia about cockroaches for you. The bacteria present in their guts that they shed like hair are practically their own ecosystem, and they're hereditary. Everyone in that room was exposed to the nymph's own dark pathogens. I saw the pictures myself, sent to me anonymously in unmarked manila envelopes, perhaps as a forced guilt trip, as I spent the next 6 months in quarantine. The hemorrhaging, the diarrhea, the bloating. Of the 21 personnel in that room, 18 died violent, disgusting, humiliating deaths. The shame I felt, holed up in my lonely cell, could have killed me too. I wish it had. They, of course, blamed me for it. I was relegated to demeaning manual labor for the remainder of my time in the USSR. That whole time I wondered to myself, why didn't they just kill me, out of suspicion that I might, do what I'm doing now? I realize now, in all their arrogance, they thought they wouldn't have to let me go. They thought they could get away with their ideological conquest, to become the dominant player on the world stage. All the better reason to up your efforts, I might say. You cannot let those rotten, shadowy devils win. There will be a plague on this good earth, much like those dark matter nymphs. Dark matter. Now we're back here. Now, I know what to call them. Now, I know what was happening. They should not have existed. By all known physical laws, they should not have existed. They did not register to us. Our own flesh and stone rebelled at their mere presence. They deserve to be jettisoned back into deep space to reunite with that mysterious, inscrutable, invisible mass. Let them feed off stardust and gas and propagate through their own untenable designs. We're not ready for them. Not yet. There have been other atrocities, other groundbreaking forward leaps that very nearly led us straight off a cliff. The only reason they never saw the light of day is because of the greater context at hand. The space race. One iota of information from those failures gets out to the world. The Soviet Union is ruined. It amazes me to this day how much more they have hidden to prop up their guise of stability and progress. The cruel irony is, something could have come from all that. The agony of defeat almost always leads to better things, in some form or another. But they suppressed it, deleted it from their collective subconscious entirely. And do not imagine yourself tall, thinking that you and the rest of the world are any different from them. The Soviets, they were just too obvious about it. What have you buried? What bridges have you burned when their direction started going awry? It sickens me to dwell on this further, but I suppose you want to hear more. I shall divulge. It's not like I have any other choice. I take some pleasure in it, but only the pleasure of expelling a malignant fever. I can only hope you learn from me. I can only hope someone learns something from all this. Independent searches of the area Dr. Volkov claimed to have worked at revealed a large patch of refurbished earth, but deeper digging uncovered no evidence of any abnormal findings. If what he claims is true, and his hypothesis of dark matter affected insects is correct, then we can rightfully guess that the specimens perished underground. It is to be noted, however, that Dr. Volkov's prior association with the Nazi Party implies the possibility of him still harboring animosity toward the United States. His testimony could be interpreted as clouded with judgmentalism and propped up by scare tactics. As for the supposed victims of dark matter-affected bacteria, all analysis suggested the patients were suffering from severe radiation poisoning, but nothing more could be inferred beyond that. There have been no other records of animals or humans from the United States launches returning with the black bruising Dr. Volkov described, although the information in his subsequent testimonies lends itself to more troubling implications. We recommend taking this story with a grain of salt. However, with dark matter being, as of now, such an obscure field of cosmology, it would be unwise to discount it entirely. If anything, his account serves to prove what befuddling and unnerving accounts the prospect of space exploration can inspire. We also recommend proceeding with our endeavors, but with a fresh sense of caution and respect.
Torches flared murkily on the revels in the mall, where the thieves of the East held carnival by night. In the mall, they could carouse and roar as they liked, for honest people shunned the quarters, and watchmen, well paid with stained coins, did not interfere with their sport. Along the crooked, unpaved streets with their heaps of refuse and sloppy puddles, drunken roisterers staggered, roaring. Steel glinted in the shadows where wolf preyed on wolf, and from the darkness rose the shrill laughter of women and the sounds of scufflings and strugglings. Torchlight licked luridly from broken windows and wide-thrown doors, and out of those doors stale smells of wine and rank, sweaty bodies, clamor of drinking jacks and fists hammered on rough tables, snatches of obscene songs, rushed like a blow in the face. In one of these dens, merriment thundered to the low, smoke-stained roof, where rascals gathered in every stage of rags and tatters, furtive cut-purses, leering kidnappers, quick-fingered thieves, swaggering bravos with their lewd wenches, strident-voiced women clad in tawdry finery, native rogues with a dominant element, sly-eyed Zamorians with daggers at their girdles and guile in their hearts. But there were wolves of half a dozen outland nations there as well. There was a giant Hyperborean renegade, taciturn, dangerous, with a broadsword strapped to his great, gaunt frame. For men wore steel openly in the mall. There was a Shemitish counterfeiter with his broad nose and curled blue-black beard. There was a bold-eyed Brythunian wench sitting on the knee of a tawny-haired gunderman, a wandering mercenary soldier, a deserter from some defeated army. And the fat, gross rogue whose bawdy jests were causing all the shouts of mirth was a professional kidnapper, come up from distant Koth to teach woman-stealing to Zamorians who were born with more knowledge of the art than he could ever attain. This man halted in his description of an intended victim's charms and thrust his muzzle into a huge tankard of frothing ale. Then, blowing the foam from his fat lips, he said, "By Bel, God of all thieves, I'll show 'em how to steal a wench. I'll have her over the Zamorian border before dawn, and there'll be a caravan waiting to receive her. 300 pieces of silver Count of Ophir promised me for a sleek young Brythunian of the better class. Took me weeks, wandering among the border cities as a beggar to find one I knew would suit. And a pretty baggage indeed." He blew a slobbery kiss in the air. "I know Lords in Shem would trade the secret of the Elephant Tower for her," he said, returning to his ale. A touch on his tunic sleeve made him turn his head, scowling at the interruption. He saw a tall, strongly made youth standing beside him. This person was as much out of place in that den as a gray wolf among mangy rats of the gutters. His cheap tunic could not conceal the hard, rangy lines of his powerful frame, the broad, heavy shoulders, the massive chest, lean waist, and heavy arms. His skin was brown from outland suns, his eyes blue and smoldering. A shock of tousled black hair crowned his broad forehead. From his girdle hung a sword and a worn leather scabbard. The Kothian involuntarily drew back, for the man was not one of any civilized race he knew. "You spoke of the Elephant Tower," said the stranger, speaking Zamorian with an alien accent. "I've heard much of this tower. What is its secret?" The fellow's attitude did not seem threatening, and the Kothian's courage was bolstered up by the ale and evident approval of his audience. He swelled with self-importance. "The secret of the Elephant Tower," he exclaimed. "Why, any fool knows that Yara the priest dwells there with the great jewel men call the Elephant's Heart. That is the secret of his magic." The barbarian digested this for a space. "I've seen this tower," he said. It is set in a great garden above the level of the city, surrounded by high walls. I've seen no guards. The walls would be easy to climb. Why has not somebody stolen this secret gem? The Kothian stared wide-mouthed at the other's simplicity, then burst into a roar of derisive mirth, in which the others joined. "Hearken to this heathen!" he bellowed. "He would steal the Jewel of Yara! Ha! Hearken, fellow!" he said, turning portentously to the other. "I suppose you're some sort of northern barbarian." "I am Cimmerian," the outlander answered in no friendly tone. The reply and the manner of it meant little to the Kothian, of a kingdom that lay far to the south on the borders of Shem. He knew only vaguely of the northern races. "And give ear and learn wisdom, fellow," said he, pointing his drinking jack at the youth. "Know that in Zamora, and more especially in this city, there are more bold thieves than anywhere else in the world. Even Koth. If mortal man could have stolen the gem, be sure it would have been filched long ago. You speak of climbing the walls, but once having climbed, you would quickly wish yourself back again. There are no guards in the gardens at night for a very good reason. That is, no human guards. But in the watch chamber in the lower part of the tower are armed men, and even if you pass those who roam the gardens by night, you must still pass through the soldiers, for the gem is kept somewhere in the tower above." "But if a man could pass through the gardens," argued the Cimmerian, "why could he not come at the gem through the upper part of the tower, and thus avoid the soldiers?" Again, the Kothian gaped at him. "Ha! Listen to him!" he shouted jeeringly. "The barbarian's an eagle who would fly to the jeweled rim of the tower, which is only 150 feet above the earth, with rounded sides slicker than polished glass. Ha!" The Cimmerian glared about, embarrassed at the roar of mocking laughter that greeted this remark. He saw no particular humor in it, and was too new to civilization to understand its discourtesies. Civilized men are more discourteous than savages because they know they can be impolite without having their skulls split, as a general thing. He was bewildered and chagrined, and doubtless would have slunk away, abashed, but the Kothian chose to goad him further. "Oh, come on, he shouted. "You tell these poor fellows, who have only been thieves since before you were spawned, tell them how you would steal the gem." "There's always a way, if the desire be coupled with courage," answered the Cimmerian shortly, nettled. The Kothian chose to take this as a personal slur. His face grew purple with anger. "What?" he roared. "You dare tell us our business and intimate that we're cowards? Get along! Get out of my sight!" And he pushed the Cimmerian violently. "Will you mock me and then lay hands on me?" grated the barbarian, his quick rage leaping up, and he returned the push with an open-handed blow that knocked his tormentor back against the rude-hewn table. Ale splashed over the jack's lip, and the Kothian roared in fury, dragging at his sword. "Heathen dog!" he bellowed. "I will have your heart for that." Steel flashed, and the throng surged wildly back out of the way. In their flight, they knocked over the single candle, and the den was plunged in darkness, broken by the crash of upset benches, the drum of flying feet, shouts, oaths of people tumbling over one another, and a single strident yell of agony that cut the din like a knife. When a candle was relighted, most of the guests had gone out by doors and broken windows, and the rest huddled behind stacks of wine kegs and under tables. The barbarian was gone. The center of the room was deserted, except for the gashed body of the Kothian. The Cimmerian, with the unerring instinct of the barbarian, had killed his man in the darkness and confusion. Two. The lurid lights and drunken revelry fell away behind the Cimmerian. He had discarded his torn tunic and walked through the night naked except for a loincloth and his high-strapped sandals. He moved with the supple ease of a great tiger, his steely muscles rippling under his brown skin. He had entered the part of the city reserved for the temples. On all sides of him, they glittered white in the starlight, snowy marble pillars and golden domes and silver arches, shrines of Zamora's myriad strange gods. He did not trouble his head about them. He knew that Zamora's religion, like all things of a civilized, long-settled people, was intricate and complex, and had lost most of the pristine essence in a maze of formulae and rituals. He had squatted for hours in the courtyards of the philosophers, listening to the arguments of theologians and teachers, and come away in a haze of bewilderment, sure of only one thing, and that they were all touched in the head. His gods were simple and understandable. Crom was their chief, and he lived on a great mountain whence he sent forth dooms and death. It was useless to call on Crom because he was a gloomy, savage god, and he hated weaklings. But he gave a man courage at birth and the will and might to kill his enemies, which, in the Cimmerian's mind, was all any god should be expected to do. His sandaled feet made no sound on the gleaming pave. No watchman passed, for even the thieves of the mall shunned the temples, where strange dooms had been known to fall on violators. Ahead of him, he saw, looming against the sky, the Tower of the Elephant. He mused, wondering why it was so named. No one seemed to know. He had never seen an elephant, but he vaguely understood that it was a monstrous animal, with a tail in front as well as behind. This a wandering Shemite had told him, swearing that he had seen such beasts by the thousands in the country of the Hyrcanians. But were it truth that man spoke, the Cimmerian did not know. At any rate, there were no elephants in Zamora. The shimmering shaft of the tower rose frostily in the stars. In the sunlight, it shone so dazzlingly that few could bear its glare, and men said it was built of silver. It was round, a slim, perfect cylinder, 150 feet in height, and its rim glittered in the starlight with the great jewels which crusted it. The tower stood among the waving exotic trees of a garden raised high above the general level of the city. A high wall enclosed this garden, and outside the wall was a lower level, likewise enclosed by a wall. No light shone forth. There seemed to be no windows in the tower, at least not about the level of the inner wall. Only the gems high above sparkled frostily in the starlight. Shrubbery grew thick outside the lower or outer wall. The Cimmerian crept close and stood beside the barrier, measuring it with his eye. It was high, but he could leap and catch the coping with his fingers. Then it would be child's play to swing himself up and over, and he did not doubt that he could pass the inner wall in the same manner. But he hesitated at the thought of the strange perils which were sent to await within. These people were strange and mysterious to him. They were not of his kind, not even of the same blood as the more westerly Berthunians, Nemedians, Kothians, and Aquilonians, whose civilized mysteries had awed him in times past. The people of Zamora were very ancient, and, from what he had seen of them, very evil. He thought of Yara, the high priest who worked strange dooms from this jeweled tower, and the Cimmerian's hair prickled as he remembered a tale told by a drunken page of the court, how Yara had laughed in the face of a hostile prince and held up a glowing evil gem before him, and how rays shot blindingly from that unholy jewel to envelop the prince, who screamed and fell down and shrank to a withered, blackened lump that changed to a black spider, which scampered wildly about the chamber until Yara set his heel upon it. Yara came not often from his tower of magic, and always to work evil on some man or some nation. The king of Zamora feared him more than he feared death, and kept himself drunk all the time because that fear was more than he could endure sober. Yara was very old, centuries old, men said, and added that he would live forever because of the magic of his gem, which men called the heart of the elephant, for no better reason than they named his hold the Elephant's Tower. The Cimmerian, engrossed in these thoughts, shrank quickly against the wall. Within the garden, someone was passing who walked with a measured stride. The listener heard the clink of steel. So, it would seem a guard did pace those gardens after all. The Cimmerian waited, expecting to hear him pass again on the next round, but silence rested over the mysterious gardens. At last, curiosity overcame him. Leaping lightly, he grasped the wall and swung himself up to the top with one arm. Lying flat on the broad coping, he looked down into the wide space between the walls. No shrubbery grew near him, though he saw some carefully trimmed bushes near the inner wall. The starlight fell on the even sward, and somewhere a fountain tinkled. The Cimmerian cautiously lowered himself down on the inside and drew his sword, staring about him. He was shaken by the nervousness of the wild at standing thus unprotected in the naked starlight, and he moved lightly around the curve of the wall, hugging its shadow, until he was even with the shrubbery he had noticed. Then he ran quickly toward it, crouching low, and almost tripped over a form that lay crumpled near the edges of the bushes. A quick look to the right and left showed him no enemy in sight, at least, and he bent close to investigate. His keen eyes, even in the dim starlight, showed him a strongly built man in the silvered armor and crested helmet of the Zamorian Royal Guard. A shield and a spear lay near him, and it took but an instant's examination to show that he had been strangled. The barbarian glanced about uneasily. He knew that this man must be the guard he had heard pass his hiding place by the wall. Only a short time had passed, yet in that interval, nameless hands had reached out of the dark and choked out the soldier's life. Straining his eyes in the gloom, he saw a hint of motion through the shrubs near the wall. Thither he glided, gripping his sword. He made no more noise than a panther stealing through the night, and yet the man he was stalking heard. The Cimmerian had a dim glimpse of a huge bulk close to the wall, felt relief that it was at least human. Then the fellow wheeled quickly with a gasp that sounded like panic, made the first motion of a forward plunge, hands clutching, then recoiled as the Cimmerian's blade caught the starlight. For a tense instant, neither spoke, standing ready for anything. "You are no soldier," hissed the stranger at last. "You are a thief, like myself." "And who are you?" asked the Cimmerian in a suspicious whisper. "Taurus, of Nemedia." The Cimmerian lowered his sword. "I've heard of you. Men call you a prince of thieves." A low laugh answered him. Taurus was tall as the Cimmerian and heavier. He was big-bellied and fat, but his every movement betokened a subtle dynamic magnetism, which was reflected in the keen eyes that glinted vitally, even in the dark starlight. He was barefooted and carried a coil of what looked like a thin, strong rope, knotted at irregular intervals. "Who are you?" he whispered. "Conan, a Cimmerian," answered the other. "I came seeking a way to steal Yara's jewel that men call the elephant's heart." Conan sensed the man's great belly shaking in laughter, but it was not derisive. "By Bel, god of thieves," hissed Taurus. "I thought only myself had courage to attempt that poaching. These Zamorians call themselves thieves." "Conan, I like your grit. I never shared an adventure with anyone, but by Bel, we'll attempt this together, if you're willing." "Then you are after the gem too. What else? I've had my plans laid for months, but you, I think, have acted on sudden impulse, my friend. You killed the soldier?" "Of course. I slid over the wall when he was on the other side of the garden. I hid in the bushes. He heard me, or thought he heard something. When he came blundering over, there was no trick at all to get behind him and suddenly grip his neck and choke out his fool's life. He was like most men, half blind in the dark. A good thief should have eyes like a cat." "You made one mistake," said Conan. Taurus's eyes flashed angrily. "I? A mistake? Impossible. You should have dragged the body into the bushes," said the novice to the master of the art. "They will not change the guard until past midnight. Should any come searching for him now and find his body, they would flee at once to Yara, bellowing the news and give us time to escape. Were they not to find it, they'd go beating up the bushes and catch us like rats in a trap." "You're right," agreed Conan. "So, now attend. We waste no time in this cursed discussion. There are no guards in the inner garden. No human guards, I mean, though there are sentinels even more deadly. It was their presence which baffled me for so long. But I finally discovered a way to circumvent them." "What are the soldiers in the lower part of the tower?" "Well, the Yara dwells in the chambers above. By that route we will come and go, I hope. Never mind asking me how, I have arranged a way. We'll steal down to the top of the tower and strangle old Yara before he can cast any of his accursed spells on us. At least we'll try. It's the chance of being turned into a spider or toad against the wealth and power of the world. All good thieves must know how to take risks." "I'll go as far as any man," said Conan, slipping off his sandals. "Then follow me." And turning, Taurus leapt up, caught the wall, and drew himself up. The man's suppleness was amazing, considering his bulk. He seemed almost to glide up over the edge of the coping. Conan followed him, and, lying flat on the broad top, they spoke in wary whispers. "I see no light," Conan muttered. The lower part of the tower seemed much like that portion visible from the outside garden. A perfect, gleaming cylinder, with no apparent openings. "There are cleverly constructed doors and windows," answered Taurus. "But they are closed. The soldiers breathe air that comes from above." The garden was a vague pool of shadows, where feathery bushes and low spreading trees waved darkly in the starlight. Conan's wary soul felt the aura of waiting menace that brooded over it. He felt the burning glare of unseen eyes, and he caught a subtle scent that made the short hairs on his neck instinctively bristle as a hunting dog bristles at the scent of an ancient enemy. "Follow me," whispered Taurus. "Keep it behind me. as you value your life. Taking what looked like a copper tube from his girdle, the Numidian dropped lightly to the sward inside the wall. Conan was close behind him, sword ready, but Taurus pushed him back, close to the wall, and showed no inclination to advance himself. His whole attitude was of tense expectancy, and his gaze, like Conan's, was fixed on the shadowy mass of shrubbery a few yards away. This shrubbery was shaken, although the breeze had died down. Then, two great eyes blazed from the waving shadows, and behind them other sparks of fire glinted in the darkness. "Lions," muttered Conan. "Aye. By day they are kept in subterranean caverns below the tower. That is why there are no guards in this garden." Conan counted the eyes rapidly. 5 in sight, maybe more back in the bushes. "They'll charge in a moment. Be silent," hissed Taurus, and he moved out from the wall, cautiously, as if treading on razors, lifting the slender tube. Low rumblings rose from the shadows, and the blazing eyes moved forward. Conan could sense the great slavering jaws, the tufted tails lashing tawny sides. The air grew tense. The Cimmerian gripped his sword, expecting the charge and the irresistible hurtling of giant bodies. Then, Taurus brought the mouth of the tube to his lips and blew powerfully. A long jet of yellowish powder shot from the other end of the tube and billowed out instantly in a thick green-yellow cloud that settled over the shrubbery, blotting out the glaring eyes. Taurus ran back hastily to the wall. Conan glared without understanding. The thick cloud hid the shrubbery, and from it, no sound came. "What is that mist?" the Cimmerian asked uneasily. "Death," hissed the Numidian. "If a wind springs up and blows it back upon us, we must flee over the wall. But no, the wind is still, and now it is dissipating. Wait until it vanishes entirely. To breathe it is death." Presently, only yellowish shards hung ghostily in the air. Then, they were gone, and Taurus motioned his companion forward. They stole toward the bushes, and Conan gasped. Stretched out in the shadows lay 5 great tawny shapes. The fire of their grim eyes dimmed forever. A sweetish, cloying scent lingered in the atmosphere. "They died without a sound," muttered the Cimmerian. "Taurus, what was that powder?" "It was made from the black lotus, whose blossoms wave in the lost jungles of Gitai, where only the yellow-skulled priests of Yun dwell. Those blossoms strike dead any who smell of them." Conan knelt beside the great forms, assuring himself that they were indeed beyond power of harm. He shook his head. The magic of the exotic lands was mysterious and terrible to the barbarians of the north. "Why can you not slay the soldiers in the tower in the same way?" he asked. "Because that was all the powder I possessed. The obtaining of it was a feat which in itself was enough to make me famous amongst the thieves of the world. I stole it out of a caravan bound for Stygia, and I lifted it in its cloth of gold bag out of the coils of the great serpent which guarded it, without even awaking him. But come, in Bel's name, are we to waste the night in discussion?" They glided through the shrubbery to the gleaming foot of the tower, and there, with a motion enjoining silence, Taurus unwound his knotted cord, on one end of which was a strong steel hook. Conan saw his plan and asked no questions as the Numidian gripped the line a short distance below the hook and began to swing it about his head. Conan laid his ear to the smooth wall and listened, but could hear nothing. Evidently, the soldiers within did not suspect the presence of intruders, who had made no more sound than the night wind blowing through the trees. But a strange nervousness was on the barbarian. Perhaps it was the lion smell, which was over everything. Taurus threw the line with a smooth, ripping motion of his mighty arm. The hook curved upward and inward in a peculiar manner, hard to describe, and vanished over the jeweled rim. It apparently caught firmly, for cautious jerking and then hard pulling did not result in any slipping or giving. "Luck the first cast," murmured Taurus. It was Conan's savage instinct which made him wheel suddenly, for the death that was upon them made no sound. A fleeting glimpse showed the Cimmerian the giant tawny shape, rearing upright against the stars, towering over him for the death stroke. No civilized man could have moved half so quickly as the barbarian moved. His sword flashed frostily in the starlight, with every ounce of desperate nerve and thew behind it, and man and beast went down together. Cursing incoherently beneath his breath, Taurus bent above the mass and saw his companion's limbs move as he strove to drag himself from under the great weight that lay limply upon him. A glance showed the startled Numidian that the lion was dead, its slanting skull split in half. He laid hold of the carcass, and, by his aid, Conan thrust it aside and clambered up, still gripping his dripping sword. "Are you hurt, man?" gasped Taurus, still bewildered by the stunning swiftness of that touch-and-go episode. "No, by Crom," answered the barbarian. "But that was as close a call as I've had in a life no ways tame. Why did not that cursed beast roar as he charged?" "All things are strange in this garden," said Taurus. "The lions strike silently, and so do other deaths. But come, little sound was made in that slaying, but the soldiers might have heard, if they are not asleep or drunk, that the beast was in some other part of the garden and escaped the death of the flowers. But surely there are no more. We must climb this cord now. Little need to ask a Cimmerian if he can." "If it'll bear my weight," grunted Conan, cleansing his sword on the grass. "It will bear thrice my own," answered Taurus. "It was woven from the tresses of dead women, which I took from their tombs at midnight and steeped in the deadly wine of the upa tree to give it strength. I will go first. Then follow me closely." The Nemedian gripped the rope and, crooking a knee about it, began the ascent. He went up like a cat, belying the apparent clumsiness of his bulk. The Cimmerian followed. The cord swayed and turned on itself, but the climbers were not hindered. Both had made more difficult climbs before. The jeweled rim glittered high above them, jutting out from the perpendicular of the wall so that the cord hung perhaps a foot from the side of the tower, a fact which added greatly to the ease of the ascent. Up and up they went, silently, the lights of the city spreading out further and further to their sight as they climbed, the stars above them more and more dimmed by the glitter of the jewels along the rim. Now Taurus reached up a hand and gripped the rim itself, pulling himself up and over. Conan paused a moment on the very edge, fascinated by the great frosty jewels whose gleams dazzled his eyes. Diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, turquoises, moonstones set thick as stars in the shimmering silver. At a distance, their different gleams had seemed to merge into a pulsing white glare, but now, at close range, they shimmered with a million rainbow tints and lights, hypnotizing him with their scintillations. "There is a fabulous fortune here, Taurus," he whispered, but the Nemedian answered impatiently. "Come on, if we secure the heart, these and all other things shall be ours." Conan climbed over the sparkling rim. The level of the tower's top was some feet below the gemmed ledge. It was flat, composed of some dark blue substance set with gold that caught the starlight, so that the whole looked like a wide sapphire, flecked with shining gold dust. Across from the point where they had entered, there seemed to be a sort of chamber built upon the roof. It was of the same silvery material as the walls of the tower, adorned with designs worked in smaller gems. Its single door was of gold, its surface cut in scales, and crusted with jewels that gleamed like ice. Conan cast a glance at the pulsing ocean of lights which spread far below them, then glanced at Taurus. The Nemedian was drawing up his cord and coiling it. He showed Conan where the hook had caught. A fraction of an inch of the point had sunk under a great blazing jewel on the inner side of the rim. "It seems luck was with us again," he muttered. "One would think that our combined weight would have torn that stone out. Follow me. The real risks of the venture begin now. We are in the serpent's lair, and we know not where he lies hidden." Like stalking tigers, they crept across the darkly gleaming floor and halted outside the sparkling door. With a deft and cautious hand, Taurus tried it. It gave without resistance, and the companions looked in, tensed for anything. Over the Nemedian's shoulder, Conan had a glimpse of a glittering chamber, the walls, ceiling, and floor of which were crusted with great white jewels, which lighted it brightly, and which seemed its only illumination. It seemed empty of life. "Before we cut off our last retreat," hissed Taurus, "go you to the rim and look over on all sides. If you see any soldiers moving in the gardens or anything suspicious, return and tell me. I will await you within this chamber." Conan saw scant reason in this, and a faint suspicion of his companion touched his wary soul. But he did as Taurus requested. As he turned away, the Nemedian slipped inside the door and drew it shut behind him. Conan crept about the rim of the tower, returning to his starting point without having seen any suspicious movement in the vaguely waving sea of leaves below. He turned toward the door. Suddenly, from within the chamber, there sounded a strangled cry. The Cimmerian leapt forward, electrified. The gleaming door swung open, and Taurus stood, framed in the cold blaze behind him. He swayed and his lips parted, but only a dry rattle burst from his throat. Catching at the golden door for the support, he lurched out upon the roof, and then fell headlong, clutching at his throat. The door swung to behind him. Conan, crouching like a panther at bay, saw nothing in the room behind the stricken Nemedian. In the brief instant, the door was partly open, unless it was not a trick of the light, which made it seem as if a shadow darted across the gleaming floor. Nothing followed Taurus out of the roof, and Conan bent above the man. The Nemedian stared up with dilated, glazing eyes that somehow held a terrible bewilderment. His hands clawed at his throat, his lips slobbered and gurgled. Then, suddenly, he stiffened, and the astounded Cimmerian knew that he was dead. And he felt that Taurus had died without knowing what manner of death had stricken him. Conan glared bewilderedly at the cryptic golden door. In that empty room, with its glittering jeweled walls, death had come to the Prince of Thieves as swiftly and mysteriously as he had dealt doom to the lions in the gardens below. Gingerly, the barbarian ran his hands over the man's half-naked body, seeking a wound, but the only marks of violence were between his shoulders, high up, near the base of his bull neck. 3 small wounds, which looked as if 3 nails had been driven deep in the flesh and withdrawn. The edges of these wounds were black, and a faint smell as of putrefaction was evident. Poison darts, thought Conan. But in that case, the missile should still be in the wounds. Cautiously, he stole toward the golden door, pushed it open, and looked inside. The chamber lay empty, bathed in the cold, pulsing glow of the myriad jewels. In the very center of the ceiling, he idly noted a curious design, a black, 8-sided pattern, in the center of which 4 gems glittered with a red flame, unlike the white blaze of the other jewels. Across the room, there was another door, like the one in which he stood, except that it was not carved in the scale pattern. Was it from that door that death had come? And having struck down its victim, had it retreated by the same way? Closing the door behind him, the Cimmerian advanced into the chamber. His bare feet made no sound of the crystal floor. There were no chairs or tables in the chamber, only 3 or 4 silken couches, embroidered with gold and worked in strange serpentine designs, and several silver-bound mahogany chests. Some were sealed with heavy golden locks, others lay open, their carven lids thrown back, revealing heaps of jewels and a careless riot of splendor to the Cimmerian's astounded eyes. Conan swore beneath his breath. Already he had looked upon more wealth that night than he had ever dreamed existed in all the world, and he grew dizzy thinking of what must be the value of the jewel he sought. He was in the center of the room now, going stooped forward, head thrust out warily, sword advanced, when again death struck at him soundlessly. A flying shadow that swept across the gleaming floor was his only warning, and his instinctive sidelong leap all that saved his life. He had a flashing glimpse of a hairy black horror that swung past him with a clashing of frothing fangs, and something splashed on his bare shoulder that burned like drops of liquid hellfire. Springing back, sword high, he saw the horror strike the floor, wheel and scuttle toward him with appalling speed. A gigantic black spider, such as men see only in nightmare dreams. It was as large as a pig, and its 8 thick, hairy legs drove its ogreish body over the floor at a headlong pace. Its 4 evilly gleaming eyes shone with a horrible intelligence, and its fangs dripped venom that Conan knew from the burning of his shoulder where only a few drops had splashed as the thing struck and missed, was laden with swift death. This was the killer that had dropped from its perch in the middle of the ceiling on a strand of its web on the neck of the Nemedian. Fools that they were not to have suspected that the upper chambers would be guarded as well as the lower. These thoughts flashed briefly through Conan's mind as the monster rushed. He leapt high, and it passed beneath him, wheeled and charged back. This time he evaded its rush with a sidewise leap and struck back like a cat. His sword severed one of the hairy legs, and again he barely saved himself as the monstrosity swerved at him, fangs clicking fiendishly. But the creature did not press the pursuit. Turning, it scuttled across the crystal floor and ran up the wall to the ceiling where it crouched for an instant, glaring down at him with its fiendish red eyes. Then, without warning, it launched itself through space, trailing a strand of slimy grayish stuff. Conan stepped back to avoid the hurtling body, then ducked frantically, just in time to escape being snared by the flying web rope. He saw the monster's intent and sprang toward the door, but it was quicker, and a sticky strand cast across the door made him a prisoner. He dared not try to cut it with his sword. He knew the stuff would cling to the blade, and before he could shake it loose, the fiend would be sinking its fangs into his back. Then began a desperate game, the wits and quickness of the man matched against the fiendish craft and speed of the spider. It no longer scuttled across the floor in a direct charge or swung its body through the air at him. It raced about the ceiling and the walls, seeking to snare him in the long loops of sticky gray web strands which it flung with a devilish accuracy. These strands were as thick as ropes, and Conan knew that once they were coiled about him, his desperate strength would not be enough to tear him free before the monster struck. All over the chamber went on that devil's dance in utter silence except for the quick breathing of the man and the low scuff of his bare feet on the shining floor, the castanet rattle of the monstrosity's fangs. The gray strands lay in coils on the floor. They were looped along the walls. They overlaid the jeweled chests and silken couches and hung in dusky festoons from the jeweled ceiling. Conan's steel-trapped quickness of eye and muscle had kept him untouched, that the sticky loops had passed him so close they rasped his naked hide. He knew he could not always avoid them. He not only had to watch the strands swinging from the ceiling, but to keep his eye on the floor, lest he trip in the coils that lay there. Sooner or later, a gummy loop would writhe about him, python-like, and then, wrapped like a cocoon, he would lie at the monster's mercy. The spider raced across the chamber floor, the gray rope waving out behind it. Conan leapt high, clearing a couch. With a quick wheel, the fiend ran up the wall, and the strand, leaping off the floor like a live thing, whipped about the Cimmerian's ankle. He caught himself on his hands as he fell, jerking frantically at the web which held him like a pliant vice or the coil of a python. The hairy devil was racing down the wall to complete its capture. Stung to frenzy, Conan caught up a jeweled chest and hurled it with all his strength. It was a move the monster was not expecting. Full in the midst of the branching black legs, the massive missile struck, smashing against the wall with a muffled, sickening crunch. Blood and greenish slime spattered, and the shattered mass fell with a burst gem chest to the floor. The crushed black body lay among the flaming riot of jewels that spilled over it. The hairy legs moved aimlessly. The dying eyes glittered redly amongst the twinkling gems. Conan glared about, but no other horror appeared, and he set himself to working free of the web. The substance clung tenaciously to his ankle and his hands, but at last, he was free. And taking up his sword, he picked his way among the gray coils and loops to the inner door. What horrors lay within, he did not know. The Cimmerian's blood was up, and since he had come so far and overcome so much peril, he was determined to go through to the grim finish of the adventure, whatever that might be. And he felt that the jewel he sought was not among the many so carelessly strewn about the gleaming chamber. Stripping off the loops that fouled the inner door, he found that it, like the others, was not locked. He wondered if the soldiers below were still unaware of his presence. Well, he was high above their heads now, and if tales were to be believed, they were used to strange noises in the tower above them. Sinister sounds and screams of agony and horror. Yara was on his mind, and he was not altogether comfortable as he opened the golden door. But he saw only a flight of silver steps leading down, dimly lighted by what means he could not ascertain. Down these he went silently, gripping his sword. He heard no sound, and came presently to an ivory door set with bloodstones. He listened, but no sound came from within. Only thin wisps of smoke drifted lazily from beneath the door, bearing a curious, exotic odor unfamiliar to the Cimmerian. Below him, the silver stair wound down to vanish in the dimness, and up that shadowy well no sound floated. he had an eerie feeling that he was alone in a tower occupied only by ghosts and phantoms. Three. Cautiously, he pressed against the ivory door, and it swung silently inward. On the shimmering threshold, Conan stared like a wolf in strange surroundings, ready to fight or flee on the instant. He was looking into a large chamber with a domed, golden ceiling. The walls were of green jade, the floor of ivory, partly covered by thick rugs. Smoke and exotic scent of incense floated up from a brazier on a golden tripod, and behind it sat an idol on a sort of marble couch. Conan stared aghast. The image had the body of a man, naked and green in color, but the head was one of nightmare and madness. Too large for the human body, it had no attributes of humanity. Conan stared at the wide, flaring ears, the curling proboscis on either side of which stood white tusks tipped with round, golden balls. The eyes were closed, as if in sleep. This, then, was the reason for the name, the Tower of the Elephant, for the head of the thing was much like that of the beasts described by the Shemitish wanderer. This was Yara's god. Where then should the gem be, but concealed in the idol, since the stone was called the Elephant's Heart? As Conan came forward, his eyes fixed on the motionless idol, the eyes of the thing opened suddenly. The Sumerian froze in his tracks. It was no image. It was a living thing, and he was trapped in its chamber. That he did not instantly explode in a burst of murderous frenzy is a fact that measures his horror, which paralyzed him where he stood. A civilized man in his position would have sought doubtful refuge in the conclusion that he was insane. It did not occur to the Sumerian to doubt his senses. He knew he was face to face with a demon of the elder world, and the realization robbed him of all his faculties except sight. The trunk of horror was lifted and quested about. The topaz eyes stared unseeingly, and Conan knew the monster was blind. With that thought came a thawing of his frozen nerves, and he began to back silently toward the door. But the creature heard. The sensitive trunk stretched toward him, and Conan's horror froze him again when the being spoke, in a strange, stammering voice that never changed its key or timbre. The Sumerian knew that those jaws were never built or intended for human speech. "Who is here? Have you come to torture me again, Yara? Will you never be done, oh Yakosha? Is there no end to agony?" Tears rolled from the sightless eyes, and Conan's gaze strayed to the limbs stretched on the marble couch, and he knew the monster would not rise to attack him. He knew the marks of the rack and the searing brand of the flame, and, tough-souled as he was, he stood aghast at the ruined deformities which his reason told him had once been limbs as comely as his own. And, suddenly, all fear and repulsion went from him, to be replaced by a great pity. What this monster was, Conan could not know. But the evidences of its sufferings were so terrible and pathetic that a strange aching sadness came over the Sumerian. He knew not why. He only felt that he was looking upon a cosmic tragedy, and he shrank with shame, as if the guilt of a whole race were laid upon him. "I am not Yara," he said. I'm only a thief. I will not harm you. Come near, that I may touch you." The creature faltered, and Conan came near unfearingly, his sword hanging forgotten in his hand. The sensitive trunk came out and groped over his face and shoulders as a blind man gropes, and its touch was light as a girl's hand. "You are not of Yara's race of devils," sighed the creature. "The clean, lean fierceness of the wastelands marks you. I know your people from old, whom I knew by another name in the long, long ago, when another world lifted its jeweled spires to the stars. There is blood on your fingers." "A spider in the chamber above and a lion in the garden," muttered Conan. "You have slain a man too this night," answered the other. "And there is death in the tower above. I feel. I know." "Aye," muttered Conan. "The prince of all thieves lies there dead from the bite of a vermin." "So and so." A strange, inhuman voice rose in a sort of low chant. "A slaying in the tavern and a slaying on the roof, I know. I feel. And the third will make the magic of which not even Yara dreams. Oh, magic of deliverance, green gods of Yog." Again, tears fell as the tortured body was rocked to and fro in the grip of varied emotions. Conan looked on, bewildered. Then the convulsions ceased. The soft, sightless eyes were turned down toward the Cimmerian. The trunk beckoned. "Oh man, listen," said the strange being. "I am foul and monstrous to you, am I not? Nay, do not answer, I know. But you would seem as strange to me could I see you. There are many worlds besides this earth, and life takes many shapes. I am neither god nor demon, but flesh and blood like yourself, though the substance differ in part and the form be cast in different mold. I am very old, O man of the waste countries. Long and long ago I came to this planet with others of my world, from the green planet of Yog, which circles forever in the outer fringe of this universe. We swept through on mighty space wings that drove us through the cosmos quicker than light, because we had warred with the kings of Yog, and were defeated and outcast. But we could never return, for on earth our wings withered from our shoulders. Here we abode apart from earthly life. We fought the strange and terrible forms of life which then walked the earth so that we became feared, and were not molested in the dim jungles of the east, where we had our abode. We saw men grow from the ape and build shining cities of Alucia, Camellia, Comoria, and their sisters. We saw the oceans rise and engulf Atlantis and Lemuria and the Isles of the Picts and the shining cities of civilization. We saw the survivors of Pictum and Atlantis build their Stone Age empires and go down to ruin, locked in bloody wars. We saw the Picts sink into abysmal savagery, the Atlanteans into apedom again. We saw new savages drift southward in conquering waves from the Arctic Circle to build new civilizations with kingdoms called Numidia and Koth and Aquilonia and their sisters. We saw your people rise under a new name from the jungles of the apes that had been Atlanteans. We saw the descendants of the Lemurians who had survived the cataclysm rise again through savagery and ride westward as Hyrcanians. And we saw this race of devils, survivors of the ancient civilization that was before Atlantis sank, come once more into culture and power. This accursed kingdom of Zamora. All this we saw, neither aiding nor hindering the immutable cosmic law. And one by one, we died. For we of Yog are not immortal, though our lives are as the lives of planets and constellations. At last, I alone was left, dreaming of old times among the ruined temples of jungle-lost Kitai, worshipped as a god by an ancient race. Then came Yara, versed in dark knowledge handed down through the days of barbarism since before Atlantis sank. First, he sat at my feet and learned wisdom, but he was not satisfied with what I taught him, for it was white magic, and he wished evil lore to enslave kings and glut a fiendish ambition. I would teach him none of the black secrets I had gained through no wish of mine through the eons. But his wisdom was deeper than I had guessed. With guile gotten among the dusky tomes of dark Stygia, he trapped me into divulging a secret I had not intended to bear, and turning my own power upon me, he enslaved me. Oh, gods of Yag, my cup has been bitter since that hour. He brought me up from the lost jungles of Kitai, where the gray apes danced to the pipes of the yellow priests, and offerings of fruit and wine heaped my broken altars. No more was I a god to kindly jungle folk. I was slave to a devil in human form. Again, tears stole from the unseeing eyes. He pent me in this tower, which at his command I built for him in a single night. By fire and rack he mastered me, and by strange unearthly tortures he would not understand. In agony, I would long ago have taken my own life if I could. But he kept me alive, mangled, blinded and broken, to do his foul bidding. And for 300 years I have done his bidding from this marble couch, blackening my soul with cosmic sins and staining my wisdom with crimes because I had no other choice. Yet, not all my ancient secrets has he wrested from me, and my last gift shall be the sorcery of the blood and the jewel. For I feel the end of time draw near. You are the hand of fate. I beg you, take the gem you will find on yonder altar. Conan turned to the gold and ivory altar indicated and took up a great round jewel, clear as crimson crystal. He knew that this was the heart of the elephant. Now, for the great magic, the mighty magic such as Earth has not seen before and shall not see again through 1,000,000,000 of millenniums. By my life blood I conjure it. By blood born of the great breast of Yog, dreaming far poised in the great blue vastness of space. Take your sword, man, and cut out my heart. Then squeeze it so the blood will flow over the red stone. Then go you down these stairs and enter the ebony chamber where Yara sits wrapped in lotus dreams of evil. Speak his name and he will awaken. Then lay this gem before him and say, Yog Kosha gives you a last gift and a last enchantment. Then get you from the tower quickly. Fear not, your way shall be made clear. The life of man is not the life of Yog, nor is human death the death of Yog. Let me be free of this cage of broken, blind flesh, and I will once more be Yoga of Yog, morning crowned and shining, with wings to fly, and feet to dance, and eyes to see, and hands to break. Uncertainly, Conan approached, and Yog Kosha, or Yoga, as if sensing his uncertainty, indicated where he should strike. Conan set his teeth and drove the sword deep. Blood streamed over the blade in his hand, and the monster started convulsing, then lay back, quite still. Sure that life had fled, at least life as he understood it, Conan set to work on his grisly task and quickly brought forth something that he felt must be the strange being's heart, though it differed curiously from any he had ever seen. Holding the still pulsing organ over the blazing jewel, he pressed it with both hands, and a rain of blood fell on the stone. To his surprise, it did not run off, but soaked into the gem, as water is absorbed by a sponge. Holding the jewel gingerly, he went out of the fantastic chamber and came upon the silver steps. He did not look back. He instinctively felt that some sort of transmutation was taking place in the body on the marble couch, and he further felt that it was of a sort not to be witnessed by human eyes. He closed the ivory door behind him and, without hesitation, descended the silver steps. It did not occur to him to ignore the instructions given him. He halted at an ebony door in the center of which was a grinning silver skull, and pushed it open. He looked into a chamber of ebony and jet, and saw on a black silken couch a tall, spare form reclining. Yara, the priest and sorcerer, lay before him, his eyes open and dilated with the fumes of the yellow lotus, far staring, as if fixed on gulfs and nighted abyss beyond human ken. "Yara," said Conan, like a judge pronouncing doom. "Awaken!" The eyes cleared instantly and became cold and cruel as a vulture's. The tall, silken-clad form lifted erect and towered gauntly above the Sumerian. "Dog!" His hiss was like the voice of a cobra. "What do you here?" Conan laid the jewel on the great ebony table. "He who sent this gem bade me say, Yog Kosha gives a last gift and a last enchantment." Yara recoiled, his dark face ashen. The jewel was no longer crystal clear. Its murky depths pulsed and throbbed, and curious smoky waves of changing color passed over its smooth surface. As if drawn hypnotically, Yara bent over the table and gripped the gem in his hands, staring into its shadowed depths, as if it were a magnet to draw the shuddering soul from his body. And as Conan looked, he thought that his eyes must be playing him tricks. For when Yara had risen up from his couch, the priest had seemed gigantically tall. Yet now, he saw that Yara's head would scarcely come to his shoulder. He blinked, puzzled, and for the first time that night, doubted his own senses. Then, with a shock, he realized that the priest was shrinking in stature, growing smaller before his very gaze. With a detached feeling, he watched, as a man might watch a play, immersed in a feeling of overpowering unreality. The Cimmerian was no longer sure of his own identity. He only knew that he was looking upon the external evidences of the unseen play of vast outer forces beyond his understanding. Now, Yara was no bigger than a child. Like an infant, he sprawled on the table, still grasping the jewel. And now, the sorcerer suddenly realized his fate, and he sprang up, releasing the gem. But still, he dwindled, and Conan saw a tiny, pygmy figure rushing wildly about the ebony tabletop, waving tiny arms and shrieking in a voice that was like the squeak of an insect. Now he shrunk until the great jewel towered above him like a hill, and Conan saw him cover his eyes with his hands, as if to shield them from the glare as he staggered about like a madman. Conan sensed that some unseen magnetic force was pulling Yara to the gem. Thrice he raced wildly about in a narrowing circle. Thrice he strove to turn and run out across the table. Then, with a scream that echoed faintly in the ears of the watcher, the priest threw up his arms and ran straight toward the blazing globe. Bending close, Conan saw Yara clamber up the smooth, curving surface impossibly, like a man climbing a glass mountain. Now, the priest stood on the top, still tossing arms, invoking what grisly names only the gods know. And suddenly, he sank into the very heart of the jewel, as a man sinks into a sea. And Conan saw the smoky waves close over his head. Then he saw him in the crimson heart of the jewel, once more crystal clear, as a man sees a scene far away, tiny with great distance. And into the heart came a green, shining, winged figure with the body of a man and the head of an element, no longer blind or crippled. Yara threw up his arms and fled as a madman flees, and on his heels came the Avenger. Then, like the bursting of a bubble, the great jewel vanished in a rainbow burst of iridescent gleams, and the ebony tabletop lay bare and deserted. As bare, Conan somehow knew, as the marble couch in the chamber above, where the body of that strange trans-cosmic being called Yog Kosha and Yoga had lain. The Cimmerian turned and fled from the chamber down the silver stairs. So mazed was he that it did not occur to him to escape from the tower by the way he had entered it. Down that winding, shadowy silver well he ran, and came into a large chamber at the foot of the gleaming stairs. There he halted for an instant. He had come into the room of the soldiers. He saw the glitter of their silver corselets, the sheen of their jeweled sword hilts. They sat slumped at the banquet board, their dusky plumes waving somberly above their drooping, helmeted heads. They lay among their dice and fallen goblets on the wine-stained lapis lazuli floor. and he knew that they were dead. The promise had been made, the word kept, whether sorcery or magic, with a falling shadow of great green wings had stilled the revelry. Conan could not know, but his way had been made clear, and a silver door stood open, framed in the whiteness of dawn. Into the waving green gardens came the Cimmerian, and as the dawn wind blew upon him with the cool fragrance of luxuriant growths, he started like a man waking from a dream. He turned back uncertainly to stare at the cryptic tower he had just left. Was he bewitched and enchanted? Had he dreamed all that it seemed to have passed? As he looked, he saw the gleaming tower sway against the crimson dawn, its jewel-crusted rim sparkling in the growing light, and crash into shining shards